climate change is like the definition of a tragedy of the commons. The future of our food systems have to be climate resilient. They have to pay farmers what they need to live. These are the smart bets to make. The resilient future thesis is kind of our synthesis of saying we think the future really belongs to these unreasonable innovators who are challenging the status quo because it's just so broken for most of them. We don't think the impact investing sector is going to move ahead unless we take the same level of impact risk as we take as commercial risk, or somewhere on that spectrum. We are able to work with a lot of huge financial institutions, PayPal, a lot of the crypto folks, Starbucks, Mars. We have great corporate relationships, and so we have been able to leverage those. I think, like a lot of other funds, if we were able to do that more effectively, that would be my dream for us.
Over 83% of you that listen to or watch this show regularly haven't yet subscribed to this show. So could I ask you for a favor before we start today? If you like the show and if you like what we do here and you want to support us, the free and simple way that you can do just that is by hitting the subscribe button or following us on your podcast app. It helps this channel more than you know. Thank you and enjoy this episode. Tim, it's great to finally connect with you today. Thanks for coming on the show with me.
No, pleasure's mine. Thanks for the opportunity.
We've got a lot I want to get to today, and I want to go through the very unique impact investing platform that you've built at Mercy Corps Ventures. And before that, you've operated businesses across some of the most challenging environments on earth, from Cambodia to Afghanistan. And right now, you're attempting to summit 52 peaks in 52 weeks. But before we get to any of that, I always start these conversations by going back to the beginning, because I believe who we become is influenced very much by our early environments. And you were born and raised just outside my hometown of Chicago. So tell me, what part of Chicago were you raised in? And tell me about the home environment that you grew up in and your parents. What kind of conversations were happening around your family dinner table, and what experiences come to your mind when you think of growing up?
Yeah, it's the very stereotypical Chicago question. You say you're from Chicago, what part is the immediate?
Makes a big difference.
Makes a big difference, of course. And nobody's really from Chicago. They're from somewhere nearby. But I like to say I was born in Oak Park, so right on the border of Chicago. So I could cross into real Chicago and claim I was there. No, I was born in Oak Park, but moved when I was quite young to Riverside, and was basically stayed there my entire childhood. My dad was a police officer over in River Forest, which was another western suburb. And my mom was a Spanish language translator at a hospital in Chicago, but was a stay-at-home mom, ostensibly my entire childhood. But yeah, my early childhood, I would say the older I get, the more I kind of painted in the, kind of idyllic 1950s American vision. It's just these summers where you just get out on your bike and roam the town, with your friends, and all this free and fun and great, and a lot of independence. And yeah, just really lovely. My biggest reflection on that time was, my dad didn't make a tremendous amount of money. He had a stable, police job, but, that came with trade-offs. One being that I could, because he worked night shifts, because he worked day shifts, all these other things, I'd probably see him, effectively 1 week a month, because he'd be, separating his shifts out, but always had the stability of my mom there. I mean, I think that there's two things that kind of emerged from that. One was my dad, whenever I asked him as a young kid, and I still really remember this, why he decided to be a police officer, it was, for him, he liked to help people. And he thought that police were, it wasn't about enforcing the law. It wasn't about, catching bad guys. He said 90% of his job was helping somebody, who's locked out of their house, change their tire. It's that kind of the doldrum of just being in the community and helping people out. That always kind of stuck with me, because it's kind of the opposite, I think, of what a lot of my friends thought about is, what a police officer does. And certainly, like the way people think about police officers these days as well, for good reasons. And then second, in order to make ends meet, Riverside wasn't, a cheap place to buy a house to live. He also ran a bunch of kind of side hustle businesses. From my earliest ages, I was, with him at flea markets, Beatle conventions. They now call them the Festival for Beatles fans, because they got sued by whoever owns the Beatles name these days. And rock and roll memorabilia shows, Comic Cons. He had kind of a side hustle business, and I would say selling nostalgia, selling rock and roll records, memorabilia, comics things from really the 1950s to 1960s. So earliest childhood days, it was always him and his buddies in these different conventions, selling things, going to antique stores, helping him put together his paper mailing catalog with all his items, pre-internet, that he'd send out every October, November. So people put Christmas orders in, staying up till 1 a.m. at the Beatles convention at the Hyatt right outside O'Hare Airport, waiting for the Japanese businessmen to come in and buy records in the late 80s that would make or break, whether or not, I didn't know this as a kid, but whether or not we'd probably have like a big Christmas or a small Christmas, things like that, right? And so really from the earliest days, kind of being my dad's small business and like all the ups and downs and challenges and, loveliness around that, frankly speaking. It was a great childhood overall, didn't want for anything, but also kind of like the interesting stresses of, I'd say, like kind of a blue collar, household, and my dad doing something he loved, but also, trying to make things work.
It sounded like quite an organized business he had in order to find the memorabilia and then to sell it. Huh?
Yeah. Well, that's like, I think, and again, as a kid, you observe these things, you don't really reflect. I'll uncover more in the future, but yeah, there was a lot of things. Like when I ended up going to college and studying accounting, there are a lot of ideas I have as a young person around like, you could have this structure, you should be doing this, or are you actually doing your taxes accurately, or, how are you managing your inventories of FIFO, LIFO, all that sort of stuff. But functionally speaking, there are a lot of things I think he did. It was all about relationships again. It was like, I remember having a girlfriend in college where her cabin burned down and there was something her mom mentioned. It was this, I think, cup from the Switzerland house at the Chicago Century of Progress in the 1930s, this World's Fair they had here. And, it was just an off comment that I think the mom made. And sure enough, within 3 months, my dad had figured out a way to find, one of those cups, right? It's just like his superpower. Some of it was obviously to connect the right people, the right thing, and make money on it. But a lot of it was just trying to like build those relationships with other sellers, traders, customers, because that was what it was about to him. It wasn't trying to maximize grow profits or things like that, right?
Your father being a policeman had its trade-offs with the different shifts, but I suppose once you got your driver's license and could get speeding tickets, it had some benefits associated with not having to go to traffic court, maybe.
I was always way too shy. The one time I got pulled over, I was too much of a goody two-shoes because my dad certainly ran a tight ship. So I was not getting in any trouble too much. But the one time I was speeding and blew a stop sign, I did not tell the police officer my dad was a cop, which in retrospect, I could have played that card. So I did end up in traffic court and before a judge who lived a block away and was quite angry that I was driving that fast, in a 25-mile-an-hour zone or something. So I ended up doing a day of traffic education for 8 hours, which actually ended up being pretty good overall. I think it's kind
of
good.
And the judge lived a block away from you?
Yeah, exactly. It was the worst possible it was the worst possible case for me. But, 8 hours in traffic school, re-education was a good throw me in the mix of like what, real world is like. But no, I think, one thing I failed to mention is, my mom was a stay-at-home mom, but like things come together in a kind of strange different ways, I guess. She, after college, lived in Latin America for quite a long time between Michoacan and then down in Bogota in Colombia in the 70s. And so she was kind of, her wild child days were living across Latin America. And as a kid, I don't think I had a concept of why she was down there. And then as I got older, it was, slowly emerged. And then it wasn't until me and my wife were in Bogota living there that, more tales uncovered of like she was there because she had a love interest in Bogota and he was significantly older and living in Bogota with this man and all these other things. And I'm sure the joke is always that, 10 years from now, I'll learn I have a brother in Bogota or something. But from earliest age, she had these kind of small stories. We'd always eat Mexican food in our house. She'd tell us kind of these tales of her younger wanderlust. And then most importantly, she really pushed me to start learning Spanish when I was in elementary school, which of course I rebelled against because I was kind of a dumb little kid. Said, I don't want to do that.
But that came in handy when you married a Mexican woman.
And many years later in the strange circle of life, I wish I'd studied my Spanish a little bit harder, but, had a great basis and enough to be conversational. But in retrospect, my mom, she never said it outwardly, but she's like, I told you so, buddy. I knew this was coming.
Your mother was from Chicago as well.
She grew up, born and raised in Oak Park, one of 7 kids, so big family. Her father was an executive at Sears, so responsible for a lot of their sourcing of new products. So he had all these, again, as a kid, just heard these, but the kind of the Mad Men days of flying around the world. He'd tell great stories of like taking 3 boats many days upriver to northern Thailand in like the 1950s to find these bamboo blinds that, were selling like hotcakes in the Sears catalog, or going to Japan, right after World War II, which he'd fought in, and, having conflicted feelings about that. But, Japanese were great suppliers for different things for Sears over the years. And so he just, again, these little things that I think as a kid didn't, like, until I was older, I was like, wow, what a fascinating time to be alive, taking the old Pan Am flights, 5 flights to get over to Japan or Thailand, these places I would later live and explore. He would talk about having the Singapore slings at the raffles in Singapore, and like all these things that sounded exotic but didn't register. But then again, later in life, when I was getting into supply chains and living in these places, reflected a lot on my mom's father, and just how he'd kind of been that interesting kind of tip of, I guess, capitalism, post-war era, and connecting these, like, the globalization supply chains, which was fascinating to me. Way easier than going on Alibaba or way harder than going on Alibaba these days, right? And just
well, I mean, just to think about doing that for Sears, one thing's to go out there and do a deal, but to do that for Sears, which I might have to put a link to what that means in the show notes.
I was saying most viewers might not even know what Sears is anymore. But I was in Mexico a few months ago, and there were still Sears down there, which I think they're all gone from the U.S.
I actually lived in Mexico and still do part-time. And I don't think I know exactly the story, but actually to eat at the Sears restaurant in Mexico City is still quite a nice experience. I think it's a franchise or something like that. So you went off to University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. I've also spent a lot of time near there in Culver, Indiana. My parents had a lake house in Maxinkuckee, and I know a bit about it. And while you were there, you studied accountancy, business administration, and wait for it, Japanese language study.
Right.
That's not exactly a standard career track. What was your thinking process? Were you following a specific plan, or were you just following curiosity and trusting that this would lead somewhere meaningful?
Or, up until high school, I wasn't a very good student. I just wasn't interested. I did okay, but I was kind of middle of the pack. And there was something in high school that clicked a bit. I'm not sure what it was. I'll uncover that somehow in therapy or something else later. But I think probably like a lot of kids that age, I kind of wanted to break away somehow, right? I was like, I'm kind of sick of this suburban life. I mean, it was a great upbringing. It was perfect, like I described. But at the time, probably a bit boring. I probably had this like underlying wanderlust, which I hadn't identified. And I was just like, I want to get out. And the path I think my parents had pointed, my dad never finished his college degree. My mom, wasn't able, because she was one of 7, to kind of realize her dreams of the college she wanted to go to. She went to a local community college, which she loved, and it was great for her. But, I think she also kind of instilled me with that, like, hey, look, if you do it, you can go wherever you want. And so, for some reason, I just latched onto, I'm gonna study as hard as I possibly can. And, in the end, I did well enough to get into a few colleges. I chose Notre Dame, not for any logical reason, I would say, giving 18-year-olds sign this $100,000 to $200,000 debt package, for your life. Like what, I don't know what I was thinking, but again, whether it was divine destiny or something, it ended up being the perfect place for me. In that, to me, it's kind of an extended summer camp from high school, right? You're still in this bubble. It's still I was raised Catholic, but not really a practicing Catholic. So there was that kind of communal family spirit. It wasn't kind of, I think, the big city kind of college life my friends had at U of C or Northwestern. And I think for me, that change, that gradual shift to adulthood was good at Notre Dame, right? It was kind of a more sheltered place. There were more rules in place, boys and girls, separate dorms, girls can't come over after 8 p.m., things like that. And kind of lame, but also at the same time, I think a little bit more of a step. So, I mean, I was, I think like a lot of 18-year-olds, a bit schizophrenic in what I wanted to do. I came in as an architecture student, quickly decided that wasn't for me. And then, shifted to history because I just loved my history teachers in high school. And then, I think I latched onto film because I loved watching movies. Like all through high school, I was an audiovisual in high school. I loved making films with friends. I enjoyed it. But I think similar to architecture, I quickly realized that like it was a passion, but the actual work, I wasn't going to hack it. You have to be willing to hold a boom mic for 10 years and making no money to maybe have a chance at, progressing. And I wouldn't progress in it. I liked it as a hobby and for fun and to dissect films. And so, but I kept it because, like college is a wonderful gift to explore things. And so I kept kind of film around, business administration, I think was that like many undergrads face like, yeah, this is a practical thing that, like coming from my dad's side, like, yeah, be an earner, pay the bills, like stability. So I think part of it was from a place of like, I grew up in a small business. I was really good with numbers. My dad made me, calculate Cook County tax, which was not easy. Back then it was 7.25% off the top of my head for all their sales. So like I was good with numbers. I was good at like kind of understanding business and trade and that stuff. And so accounting was kind of a natural thing for me to get into, and one where, especially back in the early 2000s, there was lots of accountants waiting to be employed. So I think it was from a place of like safety and kind of familiarity. And then Japanese was more just, I don't know why I chose Japanese. I think it was either a registration error or I was just kind of, I want to learn something like a secret language, something totally different. So yeah, got into Japanese and just loved it. And I would say like, yeah, in no way do all three of those things kind of emerge in my career today or anything I've done since then. But I've drawn different things from each of those that have, really, brought me to where I am. The most transformative thing for Notre Dame, I mean, for me was just, my freshman year, I was walking back to my dorm and there was this guy with a huge backpack on selling books in front of like the La Fortune Cafe, this cafe student union. And he was giving talks at night on how to backpack around the world for like $1 a day. I can't remember the author's name. It wasn't like Lonely Planet. It was somebody else. And again, I was like my second semester, freshman year. And I remember going to his talk being like, yes, this is what I want to do. I want to travel the world. Like I've never been out of the US at that point. Found an internship in China that summer and saved up a bunch of money doing a bunch of little jobs and things. And then, yeah, taught English in rural China for the summer and traveled around kind of on the money I'd made myself, hustling all these jobs. And then I was just like, yes, I love Asia. I want to travel around. I just love the experience of like getting to know these other places. And that was kind of like Wanderlust ignited.
While you were at university, you joined a microfinance club. And this is right around the time when the movement was just starting to gain momentum globally. And there were people like Muhammad Yunus, who was the Bangladeshi economist that pioneered the concept of microfinance. So I guess we're talking about early 2000s. What was it about that space that captured your imagination, and how did that relate to you? Was that before or after you went to China?
Yeah, that was after I went to China. But the club I joined was called the Student International Business Council. So it was kind of this student club of business students who I would say broadly were trying to do good or work in like international commerce. And so I was in that club. I was kind of in the good cohort. And that, back then it was, I would say, being defined, right? This was like pre-impact investing. Microfinance existed, but it was working its way into, I think, the public consciousness. And so a lot of what I was doing in that club was there was these kind of small businesses in like Nicaragua, in Asia, that the club was helping to try to find markets, like these artisan businesses that were, doing good, maybe employing people who were very impoverished, employing, women who suffered, human rights abuse, things like that. So it was kind of like that, I'd say, social enterprise 1.0. And a lot of what the student members were doing with MBAs and the later, master's groups was like, how do we help these, small artisans like export to the US and find markets? How do we help them get into 10,000 villages, things like that. So my sophomore year with that club, I went to northern Thailand near the Burmese border, and then backpacked around Vietnam and Cambodia and met with a bunch of like different, again, I'd say social enterprises 1.0 and microfinance institutions. There's some really famous old ones in Cambodia. And I think that's where I kind of started really digging into it, really getting excited by all the promises around microfinance. It's like these are undercapitalized markets. You have these great small businesses with just a bit of credit, maybe other financial services, could really grow, have a tangible impact on poverty alleviation and other things. And then, again, in like the perfect kind of alignment of the universe, there were a few professors at Notre Dame who decided to create a 2-semester class my senior year, kind of recognizing these different trends and saying, how might we form an interdisciplinary program whereby, we bring together not just business students, but, students from across different colleges and kind of explore these themes around, again, what I would say is impact investing, but around what they call micro franchising, micro enterprise, microfinance, all these different things. So it was a group of like development professionals, business administration, people. We had people from arts and letters. Eventually my wife, she was in the second semester of that class, not my wife at the time, obviously. But it was it really structured, I think, a lot of what was happening and gave it, to me, a bit of a vision around like, this is something that's growing. And then, again, most critically, the second professor, so it was Melissa Paulson, who's the Notre Dame professor, and then an adjunct professor, Frank Bellotti, both of which remain to this day good friends. I would say were huge in my inflection point to take a leap to build a career in this industry, if you will. And Frank had been just a serial entrepreneur. And, again, he was a successful CEO many times over. And I think was personally interested in trying to give back to the Notre Dame community and help students like make a transition into where business can, do social good. And so between these two people, they really, I think, gave me like a good structured idea of what's happening in the space. And then, most importantly, just a tremendous amount of encouragement and just maybe self-confidence and belief that this, as opposed to taking a job with Deloitte, which every good accountant should do, decided to take a leap and, help co-found a social enterprise in Cambodia and move into that direction.
And at that point in time, you got an email from Daniela Papi, who was an alumna from Notre Dame working on a company called Pepe Tours.
Yeah, that's right.
Asking you for help with a business plan. Was that at the end of your university studies?
That was, I believe, probably my first semester senior year. She sent out an email, back in the day, they had these listservs where everybody would get hit with barrage with these emails. And she just sent it out to everybody in this club. I talked about my freshman year Student International Business Club or Student International Business Council. Yeah, she just said, hey, like I'm thinking about setting up. Her story was that she was living in Japan, teaching English with the JET program. She had an idea that, could we kind of do these ecotourism trips? Everybody rides a bike across Cambodia. I really give people, way ahead of her time in terms of exponential learning, but like, could we, help people really understand the country at the pace of two wheels? Could we help them see these social entrepreneurs who are doing incredible work? And then basically move all the money that we're charging for this, back to those social entrepreneurs to help them with all their kind of grassroots efforts that they're building. And so she had done kind of what we would say is like an MVP. She had, done a few of these bike rides, great success, had National Geographic paying attention, things like this, again, in the early 2000s. And she was looking for some, seasoned accountant to help her build a financial model. And so, I was probably the quickest to respond to her email and said, yeah, sure, I can do that, which of course I had no idea to build a financial model, but it sounded more interesting than doing, whatever tax accounting class I was supposed to be doing. So I responded right away and said, hey, I'd love to help you out. Danielle and I, again, another person who really an inflection point, somebody who was willing to take a bet or had a lack of any other option. I helped her structure the business plan, financial model. And then she ended up winning the business planning competition at Notre Dame, getting a bit of money to really, build it out. And then, my senior year kind of was trying to decide what to do next in life. And do I go for kind of an accounting job or do I kind of dive into what I kind of loved, which was, being in Asia, number one, and number two, really exploring kind of, again, social business, microfinance. And this was one thing I said, I'll make the leap. And so much to, my parents never vocally voiced their discontent about it. I think my mom certainly understood it from her path, but, I think partially too, I give them a lot of credit for not, like my college, like I was, Notre Dame gave me a very good scholarship because I wasn't coming from, great means with my father's income, but I still had some debts to pay. And, I'm sure that in their vision, I should be living in downtown Chicago, working at Deloitte or doing BCG or something else. And so I'm very thankful that they kind of let me leap off that and go work in Cambodia for $200 a month as CFO of Pepe Tours. And I think they had no idea. I still don't know if they know exactly what I was doing there, but giving me a lot of trust and a lot of space to figure it out.
So you got out of university and then you ended up spending nearly a decade in Asia. you were building businesses in a lot of challenging environments like Cambodia and Vietnam and Afghanistan. Walk me through that journey, and what were you optimizing for during those years?
I wanted to kind of land in Cambodia and hustle and do whatever I could to make Peppy Tours a success. I mean, at the same time, my entire life, I've always had, probably drawn from my father, my superpower is multitasking. So with Peppy Tours, immediately I wanted to kind of understand more about microfinance. So in my spare time was connecting with, like the CEO of Acelia, different microfinance institutions. I was just kind of keen to say, hey, I'm here. I probably flubbed what I could do for them, but I was excited to help whatever they're doing just to kind of get experience and dive a little bit deeper. I mean, one of those groups I worked a bit with was called First Finance. And so I got to know Nick Lazos, one of my really good friends, and then Talmadge Payne, one of the founders of First Finance. And that was one where, again, a startup microfinance institution way ahead of its time. They, I think, saw the inflection point in growth that the Cambodian market was going to take in terms of home ownership. I mean, up until that point, when I first arrived in Cambodia, there was really one bank providing a mortgage product. You had to put, somewhere around 60% down. Mortgage rates would be, I think, north of 30% a year. Essentially, home ownership was entirely unaffordable and based on a very risk-averse position of the market. At that point, a lot of tuk drivers I knew in the street or motorcycle drivers would probably make $20 a month. But, this was like pre-explosion of the garment sector, a lot of the economic growth that would happen in Cambodia. A group of Khmer folks and expats kind of came together to create this microfinance institution saying that, we think we can democratize ownership, home ownership. We think that the institutions that exist now are being a bit too risk adverse, and that they founded this MFI to do that. I was helping them, originally a bit with financial modeling, helping to build their website, pretty much, whatever I could do to get my foot in the door and getting to know kind of the principles and team behind it, and just learning to learn the microfinance business. I did a bit of work with Kiva at that point as well. Just doing what I could to kind of connect with other social entrepreneurs, microfinance experts, and so forth on those early days while I was at Peppy Tours. And then eventually moved in full-time to a venture builder called Hager Social Enterprise Group. And that's where kind of, again, incredible platform to work with. A lot of the folks at First Finance were involved with Hager Social Enterprise Group. And so it was great to work with them because effectively that was a platform where they had built a few different businesses in Cambodia over the last 15, 20 years, but were looking to set up an impact investment fund that could then either, build more ventures across Southeast Asia and Afghanistan, or invest in other ones. It was a great opportunity to kind of dive into a bunch of businesses that had achieved, pretty big scale and really great depth of impact across like industrial catering, across like water and sanitation provision in Cambodia. Others like trying to look at really challenging issues and like Afghanistan, like how do we promote, women's employment and empowerment, which is no easy feat in a place like Afghanistan. So it was partially part investor, part, working with the CEOs of each of these companies and kind of an advisory role. And then, partially like having to go in and like restructure businesses, sometimes take on leadership of them, especially after the financial crisis. So it was a great learning curve. And again, just like, especially Talmadge, my boss there and counterpart and business partner and friend to this day, again, a lot of trust in a 23-year-old to do all these things. I don't know what he was thinking, frankly speaking, but I hope I did a good enough job. And, I didn't get fired at least immediately, but I feel very like honored that group of investors and team and Talmadge in particular were willing to take a bet on, young me with flip-flops, no real and, good, nice shoes yet to do some of these things.
You said that in developed markets, you have unlimited talent and unlimited capital, clear rules, and a level playing fields, but none of those exist in emerging markets. And you had to think differently about everything from financing to distribution to social marketing. How did you come to understand this? Was this something intellectually, or did you learn it through painful experience and tuition payments in the school of hard knocks?
Well, every country is so different. Cambodia is completely different than Vietnam, which is utterly different than Afghanistan or Indonesia. So I think what attracts me to emerging markets is just the complexity of it and maybe the pain and suffering. And that might be like my Catholic cultural upbringing, just the joy of suffering. But yeah, no, I think it's just more, it's fascinating, and it started to me, I think it clicked. Like the conversation I can think about is, one of my bosses at Hagar was the founder, Pierre Tommy, the quintessential Swiss Italian man. He was the honorary consul general in Cambodia. He'd been there since the late 80s. One of these folks, he's been through the Vietnamese occupation, been through the attempted coups. I mean, one of these guys who's in Cambodia forever, not a tourist coming in and out, not opportunistic. He's committed to that place. And also the quintessential Swiss diplomat. So I think, he taught me, number one, just the value of patience. We would get a letter from one of the various ministries of taxation in Cambodia, and my initial reaction at 23 would be to freak out. And he's like, no, hold, we gotta just let this sit for a little bit. Let's go have tea, figure out what's really happening. Number one, we're never paying bribes or corruption. Like that's your fast ticket to be fleeced for the rest of your life if you're doing business in these places. But you need to operate a bit slower and see what's kind of going on behind the scenes. And then two, this was a guy who, it was fascinating to me, especially, in my early 20s when everything's kind of black and white. You see the world as like good or evil, all these things, right? And he would still go, have lunch or play chess with the Prime Minister Hun Sen, who, most folks would deride as a dictator, kind of an evil guy. But, from his point of view, and again, probably a very Swiss position, it's like, I want to get to know everybody. I want to understand, how I can work with them. I'm not going to, he has certain like moral lines or values he's never going to cross, but like he wants to see how he can advance what he sees as good in the world with the people who have the power. If you're not able to have that conversation or create those bridges, you're not going to get far in a lot of these places. This is the reality of how business works, especially in Asia. But again, it's a question of where you draw those moral lines, which is the real question. So I was always fascinated. He would go play chess with Hun Sen, a guy that most folks would never interact with, and kind of had his respect. And he would know the royal family. He'd know the military. It was just a guy who knew how this country operated, the different power brokers, who owned this, what industry can you step on and not. And like, I think from just hearing his stories, and you recognize the complexity of the system that's been created there for sometimes corrupt, sometimes logical, sometimes a lot illogical reasons. But there's a system and it operates. It delivers in some ways, it doesn't deliver in other ways. It's, inefficient, it's unequal in some ways, but regardless, it's there and you're operating in it. And you can't pretend it's like an American capitalism flag waver to come in and change it overnight. That's just not the way it's going to work. And there also might be things that are actually beneficial about it that you don't want to disrupt, right? And so regardless, like I think that Pierre, is an incredible man, did so much for the country of Cambodia and its people, and just really deeply understood it. There was somebody that I think really helped me kind of figure out like A, why I loved doing the work there, and then B, how to have kind of the required patience and empathy to actually operate there. When I moved more into like actual operational roles, when I was running a bakery cafe chain, which was one of Hagar's investments, I was running their operations across Vietnam out of Hanoi. And again, all those things from Pierre, Talmadge, and others came into play because I was, tip of the spear when ministry of, you name it, and came and seized our customers' motorcycles or wouldn't approve our products or thought our taxes were too low when no other business was actually paying taxes, all those types of things. And just the experiential learning of like, how do you actually deal with that without, with abiding with the kind of culture and norms of, society there, and knowing you're not going to be able to change it, but you can just do what you can incrementally and see how things kind of evolve over time.
You discovered something in a conversation with a fruit vendor in Kabul that completely changed how you think about failed markets. What did that fruit vendor teach you that Harvard Business School never could?
I always tell my wife, if I wasn't doing what I was now, I would love to be like a forensic accountant or like a accountant for the FBI for money laundering or narco trafficking or something, because I just love like how capital flows like water through the least resistance, how stuff moves. Like it's just human. It's like anthropology. It just stuff is going to move where there's a market, where there's supply and demand. And, like it's simple as that. When I was in Afghanistan with Hagar, we would drive through Kardasay into kind of the main town. And there was this little pass, if I remember correctly. I didn't spend a tremendous amount of time there. collectively a few weeks. But there was this little pass, and it was kind of narrow. It was the point at which, the staff would always get a little bit antsy because it's like the natural place where somebody's going to stop traffic. There'd be a shakedown or something worse. And, and all that time, there was never any issue. But this one time we were going through, and this guy came out with an old rusty Kalashnikov and stopped traffic. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is the end. No, it was just a driver, helping a car back out or something totally innocuous. But, we took that opportunity because traffic was blocked because it was like a narrow street to get out of the car because there's this, lovely fruit vendor kind of right at that little pass into the neighborhood. It was just this beautiful array of fruits. And I was just chatting with him, and his son was kind of translating. And I was just asking where it all came from, right? I mean, most of my work to that date had been, catering, like businesses that didn't involve like complicated supply chains, and certainly not in really complicated environments. And I think at that point, I was trying to understand the Afghan economy and how it functioned with all the conflict for decades going on. And to hear from this fruit vendor that I'm probably going to flub these exact origins. So I apologize for anybody listening for the region because I might only get this wrong. But, I was asking, where's the watermelon come from? Because, again, when you look at Kabul and different places I've been around Afghanistan, like agriculture at that point was not really humming, right? The dam in Kandahar had been destroyed, which was kind of built in the 50s to promote a lot of agricultural produce in the South of the country and so forth. And I just didn't know what they were producing. I was trying to get a handle on it. But what fascinated me was that some of this perishable fruit, including the watermelons, were making their way over from Pakistan, by hand. Effectively, he said they're on mules or horses coming over the border. I'm sure not being taxed or going through customs, making their way through Jalalabad into Kabul. So quite a journey, very fragile products, relatively consistent. He said every few days he could get them kind of, in there. I mean, there was a market for people buying those. There was plenty of labor to bring them over. And he had this complex supply chain of where all these things came from across Afghanistan, from other countries, and knew, to a dime how much it costed, how much the price fluctuated, like an incredible businessman. And again, I knew this from my father. A lot of people look at my dad's business and say, it's a rinky-dink little, trade business. But, it meant a world of importance to me and my family. It's the only reason, we could live where we did and go to good schools and eventually go to college. And this guy, it gave me a lot of respect for how this person in a war zone was managing to get these products that he knew people would buy, and, to give his son a better opportunity, his teenage son a better opportunity to a good life. And so I think, for me, it was a very humbling experience. It was also just a recognition that, again, even in a place that a lot of people looked at, even in the good days, like 2009, 2010, is kind of hopeless and war-torn. People were still growing stuff. There was still markets that were functioning. And people were managing their businesses and kind of pushing ahead and living.
At one point, you ended up studying at the U.S. Foreign Service Institute in Indonesia. So how did that come about, and what were you doing there?
When I was in Afghanistan, I was kind of making an existential choice of, do I move back to the U.S.? Because, my girlfriend at the time, who had become my wife, had just passed the Foreign Service exam, the U.S. Foreign Service exam to become a U.S. diplomat. And, for her, that was kind of a life dream. She's a Mexican immigrant. Had come to the U.S. when she was 8 or 9 years old, really embodied the American dream, right? I went to Notre Dame as well. And this was, what she wanted to do. And in my mind, I think, growing out of my 20s adventurism, especially after meeting the fruit vendor in Kabul, I was like, I want to live in Afghanistan. I want to, this is the opportunity to work in a country that's me. It's still intoxicating. It's fascinating, amazing people, amazing cultures, heartbreaking, but also just, there's so much there. And so at that point I was like, no, come live with me in Kabul. Let's let's live here, commit our lives to Afghanistan and, build some great businesses and make a difference. She won out eventually. So I finished
work, huh?
Yeah, that's how, that I can't blame her. So in retrospect, the far better decision, one of many compromises one has to make when they enter into a union at some point. And so, so I moved back to the U.S. I finished my time running the cafe bakery chain in Vietnam, moved back to the U.S. and was working with different funds, different startups, basically was kind of biding my time until she had her first assignment. And so was working with entrepreneurs across East Africa, working with a few funds in South Africa, working with funds in Southeast Asia to help them, invest in Myanmar, which had just opened up and was another country close to my heart. And so during that time, when she got, in the Foreign Service, you essentially have this flag day where they surprise you with the country you're going to go to. You have no choice really. They just give you a flag. And I think out of the 100 options for her class, about 50 were in Saudi Arabia. So I was certain we were going to Saudi Arabia, but somehow she got the Indonesia flag, which was for me wonderful. I wanted to be back in Southeast Asia, and Indonesia is just an amazing, market to operate in, amazing people. And so immediately when she got that assignment, I was able to go study at the Foreign Service Institute, which effectively is, it's based in Virginia. It's a school that essentially teaches our diplomats and other government staff how to speak pretty much every language on earth, as well as, other types of classes for like economics and you name the country, things like that. So yeah, I was able to sneak into the Bahasa Indonesia class and essentially studied that full time while I was doing consulting. And became fluent in Indonesian. And yeah, it was a great way to kind of get set up. Really a privilege. I mean, it was amazing to go from zero, not knowing the language at all, to effectively being, able to write poetry in about like 8-9 weeks. It's really an amazing thing that they can do there.
You guys were eventually posted in Indonesia, and it was while you were living there, and we're talking now about somewhere around 2014. You were recruited by Mercy Corps, which is why we're talking today, along with Scott Under, who is now the CIO at Mercy Corps. And you guys were being recruited to build something that, as far as I know, had never been done before, creating a venture capital fund inside of a humanitarian organization. So tell me how that conversation happened, and what was the vision that they painted that convinced you to take on that challenge?
So yeah, I'd moved to Indonesia in early 2014. I was, still working with a few different impact funds, consulting with a few businesses. I had made a few different angel investments that I was still kind of operationally involved in. I was looking for kind of a new big step, wanted to do something a bit more global. And when I saw the opportunity in Mercy Corps that was getting set up, I can't remember the original job description, but I think, version 1.0 was effectively sold as, let's build a venture builder inside a global nonprofit. The founding member of Mercy Corps Ventures, Anmei Chang, was one of the first employees at Google. She had, just a polymath, one of the most brilliant women I've ever met or had the pleasure to work with. Her vision was, could we create kind of the equivalent of Google X in an international nonprofit like Mercy Corps? So she joined Mercy Corps as their chief innovation officer back in 2013, I think. And Mercy Corps raised, from board members, family, and friends, a kind of initial pot of capital to go test out this thesis and vision that she had. And so when they were recruiting, they were looking for somebody to really kind of lead their ideation and venture building in Southeast Asia. It's a lot of what I kind of done at Hagar previously, kind of mixed a lot of different worlds that I'd been in before. So it was to me thrilling, the opportunity to kind of work with Mercy Corps staff across Asia, and then, have access to a team across like Africa and other markets. To me, it was just great because I'd really been just focused on Asia, and the opportunity to really learn from a wider array of team would be great. Was recruited alongside Scott, Mike, kind of a bigger team, all of us kind of seasoned emerging markets investors and or founders and operators. So it was a great diverse team. We had Jeff Wishney worked with Steve Jobs at Next Computers. We had just this incredible team, who just, again, worked in all these different markets, done all these great things. Effectively, the first 3 months were, well, let's develop a pipeline, let's test out this. Anmei was very data-driven, very kind of impressive, let's apply the minimal amount of money to test out whether this has legs. If it does, let's scale it up, let's kill it. Very dispassionate, but very impact driven. The inflection point in those early days was that Anmei was poached by USAID to lead DIV, Development Impact Ventures, if I'm not mistaken by the acronym. And for her, she saw that as a way to influence how philanthropic capital, how bilateral money from USAID is deployed. And that was, too good an opportunity to pass by. And what she did with DIV was transformational in a lot of ways, but, we were sad to lose her. What it did, though, is create a bit of space. And I think, what we were recognizing, all of us on the team had kind of recognized that venture building is very expensive. Finding founders from Mercy Corps to actually run these businesses is pretty tricky. They have full-time jobs. They're not risk adverse, but they have a full-time steady job and a pretty good income. And so jumping ship to get equity and, pay themselves nothing is usually not going to be in the cards for, somebody's worked really hard to get to leadership of like a local nonprofit. And then third, our teams were on to kind of the right ideas commercially and impact wise. But, again, they just weren't necessarily seasoned entrepreneurs themselves or founders themselves. And so with Ann May's departure, I think that gave us a bit of space. And there was probably a period of 2 or 3 months where maybe the organization forgot we existed, or who knows. I mean, they always gave us a lot of space. And I think this has been what's crucial in Mercy Corps Ventures, success has been they always gave us a lot of trust and a lot of space. And there was a period of 2 or 3 months where effectively Ann May's departure gave us space to really look back at the model, number one. Number two, the remaining members of our team, because we had to downsize, had nothing to lose. So we said, well, let's try to come up with something we think makes sense. And then number three, we felt like we had enough insights that, again, our teams were onto the right commercial opportunities and impactful opportunities, but the structure of the delivery mechanism wasn't correct. And we still had, $1 million of capital we could utilize. And so we worked with our general counsel and kind of said, hey, we want to build, a tiny portfolio to demonstrate to Mercy Corps that this is the strategy we think makes sense. We want to take that $1 million and make a few additional investments. Then we'll go back up to the board and say, hey, we don't want a venture build. We want to start an impact investment fund. And then, eventually turn that into multiple funds. So our general counsel at the time, Jeremiah, who tragically just passed away a few weeks ago, but a really lovely man, really a can-do lawyer, which you need. I said, yeah, go for it. This is the least risky thing Mercy Corps does. We're giving cash aid in Syria, like during civil war. Like what you guys are doing, nobody will die. Like the worst case scenario, you guys will get fired or there's some reputational risk. But honestly, like he saw this as like, okay, we have an LLC, that's a holding company. Go make a few investments. It's within the guidelines, broadly to go do this, build a bit, build a story, because, without actual real assets or stories of the founders we're investing in, it's still a bit esoteric to the board and other stakeholders and potential LPs. Like, go do that. And let's see if we can convince Mercy Corps to go all in on this. So yeah, with semi permission, we went out, we made, 2 initial investments, one in Indonesia, a deal I led, Vasham, and then another in East Africa, New Light Africa. And we kind of brought these to the board, not asking for permission, but apologies and saying, hey, this is what we're doing. It's great. Here's, how it's going to grow. Here's, the long-term vision. And the board was excited and bought into it. And so from there, it was just kind of off to the races and, growing the size of our first fund and then expanding beyond that.
There's going to be people listening who may not be familiar with Mercy Corps. Explain what Mercy Corps is and what it does as an organization. And when you officially made Mercy Corps Ventures, was it called that at the beginning or not?
I think we were called Mercy Corps Social Ventures, but I think we went through a few different iterations of that name. But yeah, Mercy Corps Social Ventures.
You are a for-profit VC earning returns, target returns, and all that. But Mercy Corps is a not-for-profit. Let's talk about Mercy Corps and what they're doing.
Mercy Corps was originally founded by a group of people from the Pacific Northwest, I believe in the late 70s, early 80s. One was friends with Jimmy Carter's wife, whose name I'm forgetting right now.
Rosalind.
One was somehow connected or friends with Rosalind Carter. And they wanted to do something to support the proliferation of Cambodian refugees they were seeing coming across the border into Thailand. And so the original founders said, hey, let's raise some money. I think they got a bit of money from the Carter administration to help out, and just basic food provision, tents, maybe visa or refugee asylum case processing, things like that. So kind of a loose group of people, again, from Washington State, Pacific Northwest of the U.S., who were, for whatever reason, said, this is a catastrophe with the Khmer Rouge, not technically a genocide, but, horrible crimes against humanity. And then the refugees outflowing from there, and they were helping respond to it in the very early days of kind of humanitarian assistance. And so from there, they kind of grew, I would say, organically into a larger and larger organization focused most on humanitarian and conflict response. And then, starting in the 90s and 2000s, becoming more of a international nonprofit that was doing a mix of, humanitarian conflict response. So how do we get food and then eventually cash transfers to people that are kind of in the thick of, climate disasters, earthquakes, conflict, what have you. But then in some of these contexts, how do we remain present in these communities to help them to grow economically, to, be more resilient to any future stresses and shocks from conflict, climate, and other things. And so by the time, we founded Mercy Corps Ventures in 2014, Mercy Corps was probably a $500 million a year international nonprofit. I had about 4,500 staff in maybe 40 countries around the world. And those were a mix of like hard places, like say in Afghanistan or Syria, and then other more stabilized places like say Kenya or Nigeria. The portfolio of work that Mercy Corps would do was, kind of all over the board. What we did in Indonesia was wildly different than Pakistan or somewhere else. But the fundamental kind of values were, we want to be there for those stresses and shocks that are man-made or climate-made. And then secondarily, how do we help these communities to be more resilient, productive? How do we give people agency and dignity over their lives? And so that was the platform that we were tasked to work with, right? Which was fascinating. It was very decentralized. It is a very decentralized organization. It's really driven by each country leader and their team and what they do and what's authentic to the country that they operate in. So I'd say, generally speaking, Mercy Corps is known for its work in market systems development, climate resilience, agriculture, as well as humanitarian response.
And how are they funded? You said they're 500 or 600. How are they funded?
Yeah, so prior to January 2021, it would be about 50% U.S. government across, state, USAID, and others. The rest as a mix of like EU, a lot of private philanthropists and corporates. But like every nonprofit these days or international nonprofit now, that revenue mix, it sounds weird to say revenue mix, but programming funding mix is now radically reshaped, which happy to talk about. But when we joined, it was Mercy Corps, I would say, kind of going from again being say $100 million organization in the early 90s to $600 million, $700 million a year in 2014. But the one thing I want to add, though, is there are two things that were really different to me about Mercy Corps, having been around or somewhat worked with like other international nonprofits. One was Pacific Northwest of the U.S. I mean, they didn't even have an office in D.C. when we joined. And so it was all of our meetings were like walking along the river in Portland, very decentralized, very kind of hippie-ish. It was very, like our CEO was constantly in the field, like we would joke. It's like, I was just in this camp in Syria. He's always out there, really meeting the team and staff members. It was just a very kind of, for being that large of an organization, a very human place, which was great. And a place where, getting to my second point, they really wanted a bottom-up system for ideas and to put money towards it, like really risk-tolerant for a large organization or a large nonprofit in particular. And so starting in the 90s, they, nonprofits and international NGOs, they have, their overhead costs, and there usually results in a bit of free cash flow coming off the end of that, like some profit from it, right? And that can be reinvested in, hiring, whatever it is, building organizational capacity. But from the earliest days, Mercy Corps, I would say, kind of reinvested any kind of free cash flow it had and then actively sought out kind of unrestricted money to build microfinance organizations, and not kind of your vanilla microfinance, like talking like itinerant livestock herder, like microfinance in Mongolia or like the Central Caucasus. Like they always built really kind of innovative, cutting edge, new types of microfinance, over different countries around the world. And then second, they started, investing in microinsurance from some of the earliest days, like they're in the mid 2000s. They formed one of the first global microinsurance companies called Micro. Like, let's pick the easiest market to work in Haiti. So that was where they first started underwriting policies. Like they've always been really willing to kind of found things, take risk, put, again, that really valued unrestricted money. I mean, nonprofits never have unrestricted money, and they would take that and kind of make bets on things they think could be impactful and innovative. And a lot of those early microfinance bets and then Micro turned out well. I mean, we exited our microfinance institution in Mongolia for a huge multiple. Micro, the microinsurance company, was acquired by Howden, which was an incredible signal that, a major insurance company would buy, a small microinsurance company like ours. We've grown over the last 10 years. And so to their credit, they've always given a lot of space for innovation. They've put money towards it. Our team was kind of a signal of that. They've said, hey, we want to hire a CIO, Chief Innovation Officer, to think through what's after microfinance, like what's the next iteration after microinsurance, and let's put some of their balance sheet money towards it.
Give us a high-level overview of Mercy Corps Ventures.
Mercy Corps Ventures now, we're a family of funds. So we operate essentially 4 different funds around the world. Our team is dispersed across the U.S., Latin America, East and West Africa. Our Fund 1 is kind of our flagship fund. That was the one we established, really in 2015 with our first vintage of investments. That was structured as an evergreen fund. And so essentially that wasn't money off Mercy Corps' balance sheet, but money we raised from family offices, corporates, corporate foundations, eventually USAID, French government, Proparco. And that allowed us to kind of build a track record, prove out a thesis, prove out, kind of returns. I mean, I think 2015 was still the early innings of impact investing in these markets. And then number two, trying to prove out a global strategy for doing it, which is a bit against the grain these days. So that was our Fund 1. We're just closing kind of our final investments out of that fund. I think the assets under management there are somewhere around $20 million. So kind of a good, healthy kind of Fund 1. And have done pretty well. We have one unicorn in that portfolio. We've been able to realize, I think, 6 exits to date, with another 2 or 3 we hope to in the next, hopefully 3 to 4 months. And so I think that, Fund 1, we've done pretty well over different vintages of investing. Our Fund 2, we're aiming or on track to first close with that, hopefully by the end of this year, if not, January next year. That's a target $50 million fund focused on climate adaptation and resilience. But effectively, that's like our kind of growth fund. Growth fund, not in that from a strategy perspective, but trying to prove that, in this market, we can leverage the Fund 1 in order to raise bigger amounts of capital, really lead these rounds. And again, try to show that a global climate investing strategy is a rational one in this market, when I think a lot of fund managers and DFIs and others are looking at more hyper-local, hyper-regional strategy. Our Fund 3 is a bit different. It's our venture lab. It's essentially a grant fund. And with that, we test kind of the edges of our thesis. We're very risk-tolerant investors, certainly, but at the same time, there's areas within climate adaptation and resilience and financial resilience that are kind of unproven. There's not enough commercial viability data. There's not enough impact data in order to justify those investments. So we essentially use our venture lab to partner with companies that are either too early or maybe later stage, to really try to understand whether or not some emerging technologies, again, kind of have commercial scalability or impact viability, and gather data and move in that direction. Happy to dig into more of that later. But that's kind of our test bed, right? Like, we do a lot in the crypto space and the Web3 space there. We're doing a lot in the climate tech bubble. There's so much hype around, X, Y, and Z. We can use the grants to kind of build out our thesis there, see where there's, something that we think should enter our thesis or, potentially enter our pipeline. Then also expand our array of partnerships, right? We've been able to use the venture lab to work with large corporates that, we wouldn't have a hope investing in, but we can work with them to see if a particular technology adds value, and then use that to demonstrate to the wider market that this is something that should be adopted or bought or sold or what have you. And then finally, we have a final fund that's focused exclusively on Web3. We decided that's a small fund, but we decided to carve that out because as we were doing kind of Web3 investing out of our Fund 1, it's just a totally different paradigm, totally different markets. It's probably like the earliest days of the internet in terms of how you have to think about risk and return and just the new world order that's being created. I say that hesitantly. I'm not crypto optimist, nor am I totally pessimistic. I'm somewhere firmly in the middle. But there is this strange kind of Web3 universe, and to try to do that with a traditional fund is very complicated to engage with, because just the due diligence, the return expectations, the way you run it is completely different. And so we carved out a separate Web3 fund that's exclusively focused on that. It solved a lot of headaches internally and culturally for us to do so, but also allows us to kind of engage with a technology that we think is pretty critically interesting and important and actually very impactful, but do so in a way that's respectful and responsible and, kind of allows us to carve out those risks and returns appropriately.
And you described your LPs, they're like family offices. There's no seeding by Mercy Corps.
Yeah. No, with our Fund 1, management fees were covered by Mercy Corps to some extent, especially in the beginning. And then after that, purely covered by the different, family offices, corporate foundations that we brought in over the years. With our Fund 2, that's a bit more of a proper GPLP structure where we survive purely on the management fees. That's a bit more arm's length from Mercy Corps. And so that's kind of, again, a proof of concept of how we spin this out more fully from Mercy Corps. Although having the close relationship, Mercy Corps will be a sponsor, a major LP. You can think about it similar to kind of Axion and the journey they've taken with Quona, with Axion Venture Lab, similar with Acumen. We're kind of along that journey. And I think that every one of us has slightly different, ways we've done it. With Mercy Corps, they, especially at this point, it's no secret that programmatic donations to any nonprofit are severely down. I mean, with the U.S. government kind of folding back. And so for us, our Fund 2, and everything else, I mean, we kind of hunt and kill. And so Mercy Corps will be a big sponsor and LP in it. But, effectively, we see this as a way for Mercy Corps to demonstrate that the investment strategy and track record and team has legs to raise significantly more capital on top of it. And so, no, there won't be large balance sheet money or anything coming into it. Really, we're taking kind of our exit proceeds from Fund 1 into Fund 2, as well as any assets that, we think are of value and that can entice, senior LPs in.
And your target returns, are these market rate private equity returns?
With our Fund 1, originally when we set it up, and we have a few different vintages of, how we look at returns and performance. So our first, 2 years were really just experimentation, trying to see how a fund within an NGO can do this work. Our target for that to funders and LPs was a return of capital. Like essentially, we don't want to lose capital and just prove that this thing can operate. But internally, our hurdle was we thought 10 to 15% IRR across each vintage of investing would be kind of a rational expectation. Again, predicting how these markets would have grown, in 2015 was a bit folly. I mean, it was amazing to see, East Africa just take off. Asia exploded in a way we didn't quite, so back then, we thought, okay, if we could get 10 or 15%, yeah, we'd be doing pretty well. Overall now we're, well north of that on our Fund 1. Our Fund 2, we're projecting anywhere from 18 to 22%, depending on different scenarios. So we're in a bit of an awkward middle. And I think this is, a complicated dance for the impact investing space, right? If we want to design a fund that maximizes returns, in emerging markets, we should only look at fintech. That's the only asset class that's really returned any money. It's really grown historically. And that would be the moral hazard or the impetus as fund managers, just plow it all into fintech, pre-seed stage, whether or not it has a direct climate linkage or not, or the problems that we're excited about. That's just where there's the growth and liquidity. And so I think with our Fund 2, we think we've designed a strategy that our Fund 1 supports, and that we think that's the best climate tech and the climate intentional businesses are kind of global in nature. Most of our high performers came out of Kenya, but they're already working in, South Asia or in Latin America. And number two, having a multi-region strategy allows us to control for pipeline liquidity, allows us to attract a wider array of investors because most of our liquidity is going to be on secondary markets or kind of these global acquisitions. And then, number three, I think that with our strategy in the Fund 2, what we've seen born in our Fund 1 is that despite all the upheaval happening today in the global markets with tariffs, with, aid cuts, all these different things, a lot of the founders we meet in the global South, in Latin America and in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, they experience the climate stresses and shocks. They experience the bad effects of the systems we already have that are either imposed on them or created. And they just want to shift those and change those. And so they're building things that they know intrinsically they face every day. They want to build them better, to be more regenerative. They want to build them to be more inclusive. And we think that's a good long-term bet. The future of our food systems have to be climate resilient. They have to pay farmers what they need to live. These are the smart bets to make. And as you kind of look at a climate intentional investment thesis, we think it's not only the great opportunity moving forward, whether we have the timing right, as every venture capital is concerned, it's a great long-term opportunity. Number one. And number two, we think if you're not analyzing it from a risk perspective, you're just kind of a folly investor, especially in anything that's really tied to land.
Why don't you articulate very clearly what Mercy Corps Ventures' mission and your theory of change is, and what are the specific problems you're targeting to address with your investing activities? And I think somewhere in there you have to address this resilient future thesis that are guiding your investment decisions.
As Mercy Corps Ventures, we are kind of agnostic about the tool we use. We want a whole toolkit of funds that kind of engage with the capital markets with different LPs, different partners, different startups and companies, different large corporations to address real problem sets we see related to climate adaptation and resilience. We think that, a single venture capital fund isn't going to move the bar. And certainly a single, donor advised fund, whatever it is, you lack the tools to kind of support startups and innovative tech in a way that can actually create impact, can actually move these things ahead. I mean, climate change is the definition of a tragedy of the commons. And so with Mercy Corps Ventures, we think by having a family of funds kind of across the capital continuum, we can really work an array of different partners on the capital side as well as on the kind of innovator, founder, corporate side that can, prove out real results, can build scalable companies that address real pain points around climate stresses and shocks. And then secondarily can help, more effectively and efficiently steward capital across the continuum to what is actually making a difference. And so for us, we want to build that evidence base. We want to prove we can make compelling returns, which is a proxy for these companies, products, or services, like really making an impact and growing. And so that's kind of the high level what we try to do at Mercy Corps Ventures. And the problems that we've chosen is articulated in the Resilient Future thesis. And so for us, we think climate adaptation, resilience, and financial resilience are the core issues of our day. I mean, we've all been living and working in emerging markets for our entire careers, and we see the effects of climate change every day, all the time. I had to evacuate my house because of wildfires last year in Quito, power outages because the hydro dam's failing, agriculture producers getting less and less yields. These are things that affect my daily life, not as much as an actual Ecuadorian who grew up there, but like we live and breathe it, we see it. But simultaneously, and again, this has guided our entire career, we see entrepreneurs from these places who absorb these stresses and shocks and say, we can build something better. We can build a better food system. We can build a better financial system. We can, figure out the right incentives for how we use land in a more regenerative way. And again, that's what inspires us to back them. So the Resilient Future thesis is kind of our synthesis of saying, we think the future really belongs to these kind of unreasonable innovators who are challenging the status quo because it's just so broken for most of them, and are recreating the systems that govern their lives. So we focus on 3 different areas. The first is adaptive agriculture. With adaptive ag and food systems, we're looking at different tech-enabled companies that are effectively helping farmers and kind of the supply side of food systems to produce in a more regenerative way and a more productive way. We think those two come hand in hand. And generally speaking, through regulation and other things, we're asking farmers to do more, but they're trapped in debt, lower productivity, all these things. We think that, more climate intentional, more sustainable farming has to come with some upside to the farmers, like better livelihoods. And we can dig more into it through a lot of different ways that could happen, but we see those as 2 sides of the same coin. The second is what we call inclusive climate fintech. And so about 80% of our portfolio has a fintech layer because digital financial services are really kind of the infrastructure and lifeblood to make pretty much anything else work in our thesis. We've toyed around with how do we be intentional around investing in fintech while ensuring that it has kind of a more direct climate relationship. And so with our climate adaptation and resilience framework, we can dive in more how we do that. But effectively, we look at the fintech layer as really important infrastructure. And this is a question of us, how does that kind of power different types of innovations and how people can prepare, adapt, and respond to climate stresses and shocks? And so that's our second thesis area. Our third is called climate smart infrastructure. And this was kind of born from our reflections from our Fund 1, which was that there were 2 big trends. One was, what are alternative ways we kind of value nature? We value land use that are more regenerative. So it could be the carbon markets, could be insetting. That was one area that we were kind of excited about. We made a few exploratory investments and we're long on. So that's where this kind of fits. And then the second was a lot of our companies over the last 5-6 years had been building different, we would say, kind of data layer improvements and analytics tools for insurance industry, for climate risk analytics, you name it. And so this kind of class of companies that are building, again, what we would say is kind of the infrastructure for all sorts of other things to happen in our food systems and how we utilize land and how we price insurance products and how we even get insurance products, delivered to somebody, things like that nature. So that's kind of our third bucket in the thesis. And taken collectively, again, our vision of the world is that, in 2040, through our multiple different funds, we hope that in the economies we're investing, we're seeing kind of a constellation of different investments that are addressing pain points and how people prepare, adapt, and respond to climate stresses and shocks. I mean, we think that's going to be kind of key investments of different levers in those systems, and then partnerships with others. Because, again, if we're wildly successful, we'll still only have like $100 million under management, which is a pittance compared to what really needs to happen. If we're wildly successful, we can help catalyze more capital into the space and prove that our there are either more effective and efficient ways to use kind of donor or multilateral capital. But B, if we are correct, then we think there are some real interesting returns to be made here by investing in, again, the people who are going to create an entirely new type of food system in these markets.
We haven't said it here, but you've implied it. You're only investing in emerging markets, right?
Correct. Yeah. Although we do have a number of companies that are headquartered, in the US or EU, but our litmus test is, do these products or services have a rational or existing go-to-market in the global south? And is that going to be a majority of their business, right? We're only really interested in that. And so we do have a number of companies, like Floodbase is a company that is focused on parametric flood insurance based out of Brooklyn, New York. But, for us, their roots are in Ghana, West Africa. Flood insurance is the last great kind of like quiver in the insurance toolkit that is needed, as we know from the US, but especially in emerging markets, understanding, predicting, providing early warning systems, as well as providing risk transfer products for flood is a huge opportunity. So with each company, we kind of look at the different opportunities and risks around the investment, and will it take them into the markets we care about, where we see the opportunity? Does the team think that way? And if it doesn't, great, maybe it's still a good commercial investment, but we're probably going to exit our position.
How do you define climate adaptation versus climate resilience? And tell me why the emerging markets are both particularly vulnerable to climate impacts, while at the same time also creating unique investment opportunities.
Climate adaptation is effectively the set of actions or shifts to ecological, social, or economic systems. And so that's kind of just how people and systems are adapting to climate stresses and shocks over time. And so it's kind of how they are positioning themselves for anticipated or real long-term impacts. So you could think about how food systems are maybe just not procuring coffee from a certain part of the world. They're adapting to the realities of like the fact that cocoa is going to be harder to grow in West Africa. And therefore, farmers who are choosing what to grow might be moving to other crops. That's an adaptation strategy, right? They're anticipating what they can do and trying to adapt to it in the long term. Climate resilience is a bit different. And so effectively that's how these individuals, households, communities, systems are taking different strategies to withstand disruption. It's taking for granted what stresses and shocks exist and what are strategies for them to try to maintain, if they can, by adapting strategies that allow them to be a bit more resilient. So you could think of like risk transfer. And some of these will follow for both of these. And, again, from a fund perspective, we don't get too hung up on where these fall within it, right? At least our LPs, our funders don't necessarily care. But I know in kind of the wider IM community, these can be important distinctions. For us, like on the resilience side, that's more what are the kind of modalities that are available that allow people to take the stresses and shocks as a given, and then to ensure that they can bounce back very quickly if there is a given stress or shock. And so the easiest one we uncovered in some of our research from the venture lab was, simple anticipatory cash transfers are a huge resilience building strategy. So how can we use new technologies or existing technologies that allow, say, a livestock herder to receive a cash payout ahead of an anticipated drought? So they have that cash on hand to maybe move their livestock, take a variety of different kind of strategies into effect. It's much more efficient. I think, for every dollar in anticipatory cash transfer, it's worth 10 in economic upside on the other side of it. Effectively, it's just a way to help them be slightly more resilient to an anticipated stress or shock. So that shock or stress is not as deeply felt. And so there's a lot of different ways you can build resilience in that way.
Before we go any further, I'd like to get your perspective on a couple things here that are unusual, I think, for this podcast is refi, which is financial lingo for regenerative finance, and DeFi, which is decentralized finance, and Web3. I want to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about. You've been quite vocal about how blockchain addresses acute pain points for the emerging markets. And in doing my homework for our conversation today, it seems like you invest in DeFi and Web3, and they have an important role to play in achieving impact. What are you referring to with these terms, refi, DeFi, and Web3, for people who are listening who might not be familiar with exactly what you're referring to? And then how these concepts are important part of your investing activities, especially in achieving impact outcomes from what you're doing. And what are these specific pain points that Web3 these solutions address that traditional finance simply can't solve in these markets.
It could be its own kind of podcast. And I'd certainly invite my colleagues. Scott has been one of the earliest people I know in the Bitcoin space. It seems to get earlier every time I talk to him. But I think 2014, he started dabbling in Bitcoin. It's the culture of I was in earlier. But
he was way smarter than you thought.
Way smarter. Yeah, way smarter. Yeah. One of these guys who's just kind of annoying to talk to. But depending on where Bitcoin's at, it's more annoying or less annoying. Scott's really our brain trust on Web3 and everything in that space. And then Ken, who leads our Venture Lab, also just really our tip of the spear, and Timo as well. And so I'll do my best to kind of carry the torch, and I'll give my perspective on that, certainly. But, when we think about it, we love to lean into hype. We are not scared by it, but we want to be ruthlessly pragmatic about it. And that's where our Venture Lab, and then, functionally kind of all the work we do, we try to be radically transparent. And so with our Web3 work and our Venture Lab and our investments, and you'll see this in our impact report and then all of our Venture Lab kind of publications, we really do want to burst through the hype and say, this is what works, this is what doesn't. This is the real experience of, a Senegalese SME who's using stablecoins. This is why they do it. This is the value it gives them, right? I think that's the perspective we take on it. And the earliest point I would say we thought about this was, I believe in 2015 or 2016, we had some interns in Kenya, and it was just impossible to pay them. PayPal required KYC that was too stringent. There was just no way to get these folks paid. And I think Scott, if I recall correctly, had kind of figured out, I don't think he used Bitcoin, but some other stable coin or meme coin at the time, and said, this was what the staff requested. They say, hey, just send us, I'm not going to say 3 Doge, but whatever it was, right? Just transfer this, seamless and easy. And Scott, having kind of worked in the mobile money space from the earliest days and digital finance space from the earliest days in Kenya, kind of saw this as the next iteration of all that type of stuff. A lot of emerging markets were very early to digital financial services, have really leapfrogged developed markets in that regard. You go to China and it's just unbelievable, the ecosystem of payment opportunities and how it's all intertwined. And so I think Scott very early on was saying, hey, we are seeing staff, we're seeing businesses, we're seeing entrepreneurs utilizing crypto and blockchain, and we need to pay attention to it because, it's not just an impact opportunity, but if people are seeing value in it, kind of getting back to my story in Afghanistan, if this is happening, it's a trend we need to understand where it's valuable, where it's not responsible, and then try to figure out where it's going because it could be an interesting investment opportunity and impact opportunity as well. And so I think getting back to your main question, Web3 is just one way of describing the space. Effectively, it's what is the next generation of the internet. And I think there's a larger kind of Anderson Horowitz and philosophical debate going on. But, in essence, Web 2, the current internet we have today, was created originally in a very open source, decentralized, collaborative way. Our email protocol still works that way, weirdly enough. But so much else is just, captured in many ways by, you could say, rent seekers or intermediaries in the middle. And I think the idea of Web3, which incorporates crypto and blockchain, is that we should find ways to decentralize ownership of everything on the internet, decentralize ownership of assets, of financial products, and all these things, and allow us to then kind of redistribute those benefits that are currently kind of held by different people in the middle for various, I think, good reasons to those individuals. And so I think the way we look at Web3 is, again, there's nuggets of good and signals in it, and then there's a lot of just purely bullshit, honestly. Again, I don't know if Ken and Scott and others will totally agree, but having been to consensus in a few things, and some of the greatest minds in the world are in this space, and yet we're building more tokenized gaming things in Web3. I just don't get it, right? But functionally speaking, a lot of the research and investment we've done has been around core problems. Number one, how do you do cross-border transfers with different currencies in between companies in West Africa? It's very expensive. It's very hard to do. Stable coins have a clear use case, right? A small business can essentially manage their trade finance very easily and directly with a counterparty. They don't have to move from their local currency to euros and then dollars and then back to another currency. And then in between having huge costs eaten away. There's a rationale why stable coins can really just make it much more seamless, much more automated, cheaper for all these parties. In the carbon space, I think, blockchain has an interesting use case. I don't think it's fully proven. It's one of these things where I think there's a lot of excitement around how can we use Web3 infrastructure, again, like a decentralized universe where data is open and anybody can look at it and challenge it and play with it. And you can have automatic smart contracts that trigger payments. In theory, that's probably how the carbon markets should work. The reality of moving that system there is much more long-term. But I do think the concept of having more transparency, more consensus building that's open, and then automatic ways to trigger actions through smart contracts makes sense for that market. We did one big piece of research adjacent to this with a major insurance company in sub-Saharan Africa where, blockchain, what it's really good at is what's that single truth of data, and can you programmatically trigger things to happen when different parties agree, which effectively for insurance makes a lot of sense. You need multiple counterparties to agree that a payout happens or doesn't. But the problem is getting those parties to agree kind of in the existing system is, Excel's, PDFs, emails flying around. It's slow, it's cumbersome. There's humans involved. And so typically, and I might get these numbers a little bit off, but I can send you the link on it. We did a venture lab pilot with Acre, a major microinsurance company. And the idea was, could we incorporate really boring blockchain on the back end to effectively be that infrastructure for different counterparties to agree on whether a payout happens when there's too much rainfall or drought? And can we automate the payment to farmers so that it takes not 30 or 60 days for that farmer to get a payout, but rather do it almost instantaneously? And so if I recall right, Acre went from payouts taking, again, 30 to 60 days or say 45 days on average to something like 2 or 3 days. So those farmers experienced a drought or excess rainfall, and they were getting a payout to replant their crop within, I think, about 48 hours. So huge reduction in time, the farmer experience, huge reduction in cost and complexity for their business operations. But none of that was like fancy crypto meme stuff. It was all boring blockchain on the back end. So I think like a lot of it's like, that's the wave we're in, is like, how does this incorporate and solve real pain points? I still think a lot of the hype around it is still focused on cases that don't add value to people's lives. That's just my personal perspective. But I do think like slowly but surely, we're seeing different use cases arise where they actually add value to different players.
How does democratizing underwriting decisions through DeFi protocols, how does that change the game for emerging market lending?
I was an early advisor to Goldfinch, which started in, I want to say around 2020. And my time working with Kiva a long time ago, microfinance, and then working in impact investing thereafter, to me, it seemed like a no-brainer evolution of where a lot of the underwriting decision-making can go. So effectively, the way a lot of our credit decisions are made, if I was running a debt fund, it would be largely based on, advisors that we have paid or otherwise, my institutional knowledge, whatever data I have available to analyze a particular, debt investment case. But, effectively, there's like a single point of failure or success. And I think the idea with DeFi and what Goldfinch, has built, as well as other competitors on this space, is that, the reality of like how a lot of investment decisions are made are we're constantly trading deals. I'm constantly kind of building a reputation for sending a deal that's maybe not a fit for me or one I'm passionate about to another investor and vice versa. And we're exchanging thoughts on things. But could you create infrastructure that in some way rewards that behavior, shows kind of the track record of that work, allows a more diverse array of voices to inform an investment decision, those who might actually be like locally on the ground and, have some sort of particular additional data. Could you reward not just individuals, but actually companies who build and feed in data streams or something like that? Financing is a critical inhibitor for anything in kind of carbon markets or natural assets, environmental assets. And so you can envision where you have companies that their sole job is interacting with a blockchain protocol to verify whether or not a particular, say, regenerative forest has the right land tenure rights. Like they're just specialized in that. And right now they'd be a consulting firm in Brazil, but effectively they could say, okay, we have this satellite data, we have this know-how, we're going to create some AI agent, whatever it is, to like say, give me the polygon, yes or no, this has, the right land tenure. Every time get that are queried, they put that on the blockchain and say, okay, in this ecosystem, they're not saying loans approved, but we have solved this little thing. Yes, they have the right land tenure certification, or here are the risks around it. Here's our opinion. And effectively, they could get some part of the reward when that loan goes through and gets repaid as like a way of kind of interacting in that ecosystem. And so, again, it's like you'd be almost recreating systems of how decisions are being made based on a bigger plurality of voices informing it, and then having kind of proof of that work and success and track record around it. I didn't say creating that system is very difficult. And like, how do you align incentives? There's bad actors, all those different things. But hypothetically, it's an interesting way of looking at it, right? And I think a lot of the experimentation done, say 2020 or 23 was a bit too idealistic in how humans would perform. How much can you really give to the crowd versus how much needs to be centralized? But I do think like in the long term, there's different use cases. Again, I think the carbon markets where it makes a lot of sense, where you have essentially like insurance, like lots of small firms who have very specialized scientific or local knowledge. And a lot of that can in some ways be created into automatic IP that essentially works into one single kind of consensus on whether something is happening or good, or a good loan or bad loan, or is this a good project? Is it producing the or removals you thought it would? It's a more efficient way to do it than exists now, a more transparent way. And so I do think blockchain can be that layer, potentially.
I want to drill down more on your investment strategy. You have 3 verticals that you're focused on: adaptive agriculture and food systems, inclusive fintech, and climate smart technologies. What is your investment process from the initial screening to the final decision? How do you define your investment universe, and what are your key priorities from a financial perspective?
I think it all starts with our thesis. One of our earliest, reflections when we designed the fund, the first fund in 2015, was that all of us had tried to raise from the very few impact investors who existed in the early 2000s. And we were frustrated by, this is no harm, no foul, but we were frustrated by like, it wasn't clear what they were looking for. It wasn't, the due diligence processes back in the mid 2000s was like 9 to 18 months. It just took so long to get even small amounts of money. We really wanted to design a fund. And again, this sounds like this is what Silicon Valley's been doing for years. But for impact investment funds, we were very keen in 2015. We want to design a fund that is very founder centric. We want to get to a yes or no as quickly as possible, because your time as an entrepreneur in markets that are, again, not much talent or hard to find talents, very expensive talents, like no capital, like your time is focused on your business, which is really hard to run. It shouldn't be focused on us. And so we really designed our process from the bottom up to get to a yes or no as quickly as possible. And a lot of that started with what are we looking for and how can we systematically have a process to refine that, on a monthly or quarterly basis internally. So again, we're not wasting our time or entrepreneurs' time in kind of pursuing cases that are ultimately not going to get through our IC or move forward with. So the way our process works is, again, our team's embedded around the world across Nairobi, Lagos, Dakar. I'm in Quito. We have Mexico City, Colombia. We're all over the world. We're, like any investor, really well entrenched in ecosystems, accelerators, incubators, working with the founders who have our portfolio. We worked with probably 80 startups now, at least in our portfolio. And so really, doing whatever anybody else does, we want to be the first call that anybody building in our thesis areas, calls us if they're raising a pre-seed round. That's our kind of metric to success. We don't want to see any missed deals that we wish we had done go up in Crunchbase or something else. Of course, it's going to happen, but that's how we want to be positioned. So our process is pretty simple. We connect with founders, and we've tried to, have a very structured one-page kind of argument that anybody leading a deal makes to the rest of our team. And again, we really, compared to other funds where kind of partners really direct the deal flow and kind of bless or move things ahead, I think Scott and I really respect just having a diversity of voices. We can't be experts on what the future of ag and like East Africa is going to look like. And so we really do want a diversity of voices to move cases ahead. So really that first hurdle is to get, another co-sponsor beyond a partner who can say this is a deal we're worth doing. And then as we move through that process, it's really kind of a majority rules across our key investment team. It's a little bit more cumbersome in that regard, but we think that diversity of opinions across kind of the people in emerging markets who are also, former founders and operators and investors allows us to end up with, deals that we didn't think would make it through having more conviction, or vice versa. We kill things earlier because we're bringing in more voices to kind of inform that decision-making process. So usually from a kind of first introduction and pitch to, an actual final decision, it's usually somewhere between, say, 4 to 8 weeks, depending on deal dynamics and other things. But again, we want to be, relatively nimble and fast. And then throughout that gated process, be able to tell entrepreneurs like, well, this is not a fit for us, but, here's 5 other investors you could talk to, or maybe go for a grant from our venture lab. Or, if we're moving ahead, here's exactly the risks we want to analyze. There's every reason in the world not to invest in these startups, but we try to really whittle it down to 3 or 4 things max that we really need to understand to get to a yes or no.
Tell me about the impact you look for and the financial model, and how do you balance these two?
So, I think our thesis kind of embeds how we look at impact with each of these areas. We have a whole kind of taxonomy within our 3 thesis categories, probably of, I want to say 40 to 60 kind of business models or technologies that we think are, you could say, pre-qualified in some ways. We think these are ones that are worthwhile for deeper exploration for investment. And then we cross that with our current portfolio or our venture lab pilots. So, we already have a lot of microinsurance investments. We were one of the first funds to really go deep in microinsurance. So we're overexposed to that. We're probably not going to do more unless we see X, Y, and Z. But essentially with our thesis and our taxonomy, we're trying to kind of, you could say, pre-qualify or anticipate what are the types of investments we can make and what are the types of impacts they will have. And again, the way we kind of look at it from our climate adaptation resilience framework is, do they help individuals, businesses, or communities to prepare, adapt, or recover for climate stresses or shocks? And so we're really trying to anticipate with these technologies and business models, do they fulfill one of those buckets? What's the evidence to back that up? Is there evidence at all that we want to build and what have you? And then, we can kind of look at any pipeline coming in and say, okay, smart irrigation. And again, we don't do this too scientifically. I'm describing it in somewhat of a bureaucratic way, but it's not really the way it works. But at least we can contextualize when a deal comes in from a deal lead, because it's really our team, again, in these places that have to make those split, they're seeing 4,000 decks a year. They have to kind of categorize where this might fit. And our process forces them to do that really quickly. It's like, okay, this is a smart irrigation play. It's going to really help communities to adapt to increasing droughts in this place. We've already done some irrigation. So this is the reason why I'm positioning it as a potential deal we want to move forward. And then, we go through our process, we dig, again, we want to be nimble. And so there's always a lot more you can dig into on the impact side, but we try to pre-qualify it because usually the biggest questions we have are more commercial, go-to-market strategy and other things. And then throughout the process, we'll kind of analyze where do we see the biggest risks or knowledge gaps on the impact side. And we drill much more deeply into that once we've kind of gotten through really the second hurdle of our due diligence process, when we want to commit that time to really dig into, say, the customer or farmer experience. Like, how are they interacting with that product? Is there evidence out there? Is it really actually, like, again, to use the same story, is this irrigation product really helping them overcome drought, or is it just kind of a nice to have thing? Like, that's when we really go a lot deeper to really determine if the impact is there and if we see any risks or opportunities for how that grows over time with the business.
And on the financial side?
I would say pretty traditional pre-seed investing. And so there's whatever financial projections the company has, we don't trust at all, because the company's going to go, so many directions. So for us, it's really like, are they solving a problem that is at least regional in nature? So it's kind of a proxy for scale. Do we think they're solving a problem set and have a business model and technology that can do that at least a regional scale, ideally a continental scale, and best case, kind of a multi-continental scale? Within our thesis, digital financial services generally know no borders. So, we have insurance companies that operate globally from, less than a year. We have companies focused on insetting and carbon markets that within 6 months are in 3 continents. So some of these scale really quickly. Others are a bit more CapEx intensive and have a slower path to scale. But effectively, what we're trying to do is build a portfolio that's diversified across regions, across scale opportunities, exit liquidity opportunities. So within each of our kind of thesis and sub-thesis areas, we kind of know the comps for what we can expect in terms of exit velocity and then how we work backwards. And again, we're trying to be pre-seed valuations, ideally below $4 million, or around $4 to $6 million. We want to be that first investor. We want to look at taking a meaningful equity position when the SAFE converts or whatever valuation event, and then being able to exit on probably a Series A, Series B, or an acquisition, depending on the type of company. And so for each of these, it's going to look different. We analyze it at the earliest stages. Like, what do we think that trajectory looks like? What would they have to achieve? Is the valuation we're getting in at rational to support that? Are there any proxies? But, again, a lot of these are at least, 5 to 10 year holding periods. And so it's kind of hard to predict exactly where they're going to get to when they're usually kind of pre-revenue, or the early revenue they have is not indicative of where they might go as a market.
Is it impact first and then financial, or is it both at the same time?
Again, the thesis kind of pre-qualifies the areas. And then the thesis is what guides where we give our grants to, right? So, again, a lot of the Web3 stuff in our thesis, it's hard to make a climate case for, right? Because there's just a lot that has to happen. And so this is the benefit of having multiple funds, is we can kind of say there's not a commercial case to invest in some of the more crazy carbon markets, natural asset stuff, but we can use our grants to maybe explore, the go-to-market strategy. We can explore what, say, a Nestle is thinking about these alternative environmental credits. We can use that to explore whether a go-to-market exists, which informs our investment thesis, right? So it's a nice kind of feedback loop, right? From not just our portfolio outcomes, but we have other modalities to kind of test the market and understand it. Because again, managing other people's money, we have to have some degree of being conservative, both on the financial side, but also on the impact side, right? We have to be very authentic. And do we think this, again, kind of matches our climate adaptation and resilience framework? Can we tie a direct or kind of climate supportive indirect linkage between this investment and an actual climate outcome? And so we have to balance the two. But generally, we pre-qualify, the investments in our taxonomy. We think this type of technology or business model, meets our framework in this way. And usually most of the questions we have, at least for the first two stages of diligence, are really just core. Is this business going to work? What's the customer journey? And what's the financial strategy? And then we go back and do a much deeper dive on the IMM side.
Quantifying impact outcomes is always challenging for all impact investors. No universal way to do this. But you've developed something called the CAR framework, which is an acronym. And in this business, we love acronyms, right? So CAR stands for Climate Adaptation and Resilience Framework, which I think you've made available publicly. This seems to be core to how you evaluate the potential investments. Give me a walk through this framework, and starting with how you determine the link between a solution and its resulting climate resilience impact.
This was really based on many years of kind of refining our thesis. When we started, we were not, in 2015, we were not a climate intentional investor, right? We were focused on livelihoods improvements, productivity of farmers and other things. And really, the first 2 years after our first vintage of investments, especially in agriculture, we, of course, saw the climate stresses and shocks. Like I remember being out in fields in South Sumatra with Vasha, one of our first investments, and just hearing about, the rains weren't coming on time, and then they came, and they would plant they plant their rice crop or maize crop depending on the rains. Historically, if it rains 3 days, you plant. It rained 3 days, they planted, and then there was drought for 60 days, and they lost their whole crop and livelihoods. You could just see it, right? I think anybody investing, especially in agriculture, is the canary in the coal mine. And so, starting in 2017, we really started to think through what would it be to have a climate lens to our investing. And then 2019, 2020 is when we kind of said, okay, we're going to focus on this as a thesis, because not only is it risk and downside, but really this is the opportunity set in front of us. And so starting in 2019, 2020 is when we formulated the resilience future thesis. And then the problem set we had was, well, how do we then determine which investments actually qualify? How do we measure success afterwards? And that's where, Lily and our team really took the lead, and a huge kudos to her. Everything that existed out there we saw to date was fine for private equity, for kind of growth stage capital, perhaps. I think the work that Jay Coe and Lightsmith have done, the work that different group actors in GIN, IFC have done is great. But kind of like ESG, applying that to pre-seed venture capital fund, where you don't have much information, where companies take a lot of twists and turns, especially in certain markets, you have to make investment decisions a lot faster. And, again, getting reporting from these companies is a whole other conversation. It's really tricky. And so I think what Lillian really did with, the collective brain trust of our team and a lot of advisors was, how do we distill this down to its most simple level so that we can authentically say that the investments we're making do ladder up towards building climate adaptation and resilience capacity, but then allow for some risk in that we don't think the impact investing sector is going to move ahead unless we take the same level of impact risk as we take as commercial risk, or somewhere on that spectrum, right? Because what we saw is a lot of climate funds were so hampered that they required so much consensus or comfort or data that what they were investing in was kind of like what we'd say is a climate unicorn, that they just couldn't move money. I won't want to name funds, but we especially saw this in agriculture. Unless you were seeing a business that was doing like pure regenerative ag and had no negative externalities, like no chemical inputs, all these things, like they couldn't invest. And like that's just not the reality of, like farmers here have to eat and live. I mean, of course they're using conventional inputs and conventional ag practices. To me, the question is like the better investments are the ones that actually push that transition. And so I think a lot of climate finance has hampered that. And again, we want to design a framework that allows us to kind of look at each case and define that pathway and a hypothesis of it and how we measure it. And so, with ours, like the overall idea is that we think that climate smart solutions, and I use this broadly, essentially allow these actors, communities, businesses to allow for climate adaptation, like allows them to kind of shift behavior and take actions that can adjust to short and long-term climate impact risks, which allows them to build resilience to any sort of stresses and shocks and reduces their vulnerability to future risks. And so whenever we look at any type of investment, from the earliest stages, we kind of categorize into three areas, and this is all available on our website. But we kind of look at, does this company have a direct relationship, what we call level 1 relationship, in the short or medium term to climate resilience? And so there'd be obvious things like irrigation. If there's a weather stress or shock, irrigation is going to help that farmer to make sure they can get that back. Level 2 is more climate supportive. There's somewhat indirect. So a lot of our companies and say climate risk analytics are focused more on that level 2 layer. They're kind of amassing different data from the ground, from the sky, to create kind of analytical tools for then, say, a financial institution or an insurer to design insurance products. And so they're not directly working with an impacted or potentially impacted person to help them overcome a climate stress or shock, but they're kind of critical for that ecosystem existing, and eventually it's going to reach those populations. And then level 3 is non-climate. So there's just not a clear link. That a vanilla payment processor in fintech wouldn't qualify, because there could be an argument made that it indirectly does something in climate, but it's really not the intentionality behind it. It's just too far indirect. And so that's like our first litmus test. And then beyond that, the way we look at it again is within each of these investments, we want to articulate very clearly, how does this company help the target user, customer, partner to prepare, adapt, or recover from a climate stress or shock? And we want the company and whoever's leading an investment to clearly be able to articulate that, so that we can actually measure it and determine if that's true or not.
Level 1, level 2, they advance through your process. Level 3, they don't advance.
Yeah, we don't move ahead.
But then you have some kind of taxonomy that you apply, that's prepare, adapt, recover. How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So an easy example is an insurance space. So we give an example of an agriculture insurance company that offers parametric crop insurance in Africa, and a preparation one, that insurance that is obtained before a climate-related shock occurs. The insurance can help improve the adaptive capacity of a smallholder farmer and enable preparedness. And so essentially they have that insurance product. It allows them to maybe think through how they're planting differently. A lot of those insurers will also provide some sort of adjacent advisory services. It essentially allows that farmer to know they are covered, maybe take on additional risk. Like a lot of the evidence points that insured farmers in a lot of these markets tend to take more risk-tolerant positions. They expand their production. They do things because they know that their downside is protected, right? On the adapt side, relatively straightforward. So the crop insurance enables the transfer risk from the individual farmer to the insurer. So if there is any sort of stress or shock, again, drought, excess rainfall, flood, they're reducing the immediate kind of effects of that because they have the insurance and risk transfer. And then finally, if from the recovery standpoint, if the payout is triggered, again, this is the kind of big upside with the risk transfer mechanism. Their losses are covered, and usually what's most important is they are able to operationally continue moving their business forward. They can replant, they can pay their employees, whatever it is. And so this is, again, why we've really pushed into the insurance space, is because it's not the silver bullet, but a lot of the evidence we had seen and then we've generated through our portfolio shows that it is a really, that downside protection enables these business owners, these farmers, to usually expand what they're doing because their downside is protected. If an event does occur that triggers it, they can very quickly maintain production or re-enable production, keep people employed. Like the ripple effects of just that single product, as large or usually larger than other types of interventions that we see in the climate adaptation space.
And at what point in the process do you decide that you're going to invest?
Well, I mean, again, we have kind of a 4-stage process. If you ask a deal lead, usually they have conviction from the beginning, and the rest of our team is trying to pull them back from what they're excited about to some extent. All of us together, we all have that. You get really excited about these things. But generally speaking, again, when we get to that 4th stage, which, like, maybe I'll just describe it overall. Like I said, we have that one pager where usually that's this pre-qualifying deal. Does it fit in our thesis? Where? How? Does it level 1, level 2, level 3? Forget it. Don't bring that deal to the team. And then within the CAR framework, what's our initial idea? Because it's so early. It's usually a pitch deck in one conversation. But what's your initial idea of, like, prepare, adapt, recover? How does this product or service or company fit within that? And then the idea behind that first gate is, let's assemble the team's brain trust. You don't need, a majority rule to move forward. But what we want to do is download everybody's perception of risk, opportunity, and like hard team members' perspective on it, so that we can then funnel the due diligence in a productive way. Because again, at the pre-seed stage in these markets, there's a million reasons not to invest in any of these companies. And what we're trying to do is to hone in that to the most critical areas of diligence, so that whoever's pushing a deal ahead is effective and efficient in their time and the entrepreneur's time. And so when we move on to the next stage, it's a much more built out investment memo. We're going deeper into kind of mostly the key financial business go-to-market side, founder due diligence. If it passes that stage, we go to a founder call. And we introduced this a few years back because so often some of these deal-making processes can just be whoever's leading a deal parroting what they hear from the founder. And ultimately, we're believing in the founder. And so usually we get the founder of the room with the whole team, some of our IC members too. And we just directly have the opportunity to engage with them. And after that point is usually when we make the final investment decision, unless there's some, key areas that we're just not comfortable with.
In your 2023 impact report, it includes a candid fails and lessons learned section, which is rare and pretty valuable level of transparency for a VC fund. Could you share one or two of the most surprising or the most challenging lessons learned from 2023 and how that influenced MCV's approach?
I mean, I can say this easily. It's like a pre-seed, very risk-tolerant fund. But one of the things that's frustrated us is how a lot of DFIs and a lot of other capital players are debating very specific taxonomy or terminology between like adaptation or resilience. Like there's a lot of debate about what qualifies as this type of investment versus risk tolerance and actually getting money out there. And I think climate is the only kind of investment class where the half-life, it just gets worse every year. Like the longer we don't get money out there or do anything, the more expensive it becomes, the more unsolvable some of these problems become. And then depending on your outlook in life, if we're not investing in, at the risk of my wife's employer getting angry, if we're not investing in, making more climate smart farming solutions in Latin America, you're going to have a lot more migration in the US. I mean, these are the kind of short-term perspectives on how we kind of address these core problems. And so I think the biggest thing we've said is that we see a lot of knowledge gaps, of course, like how do you actually get farmers to adapt climate smart technologies, let alone regenerative practices? But we can't wait for a bunch of scientists or PhDs to develop a paper on it and give us that data. We need to develop it ourselves. We need to take as much impact risk as commercial risk within realm. And, we have to be thoughtful and authentic, but we need to allow, especially for us early stage investors, we have to take some risk that the investments we're making might not turn out to have the impact case we're hoping for in order to push the sector ahead. Because if we don't take that risk, then I think we're just going to wait forever for money to kind of move into the space. So we see that as kind of our role. So that was the biggest one, right? Like we saw a lot of investments we made that, the earliest days we had to kind of defend why we thought they were kind of climate linked. But in reality, they ended up having a huge outsized climate impact. We did an investment in a factoring company in Central America. The most boring type of, financial services company is factoring. But the reason we did it is because half of their clients were small farmers, mostly selling export businesses. And when we started to do due diligence in the company, I credit Dan on our team because he defended this deal. I was very opposed to it originally. And like the more we dug into it, like, of course, like, allowing these farmers to access payments like 170 days earlier is transformative, because if they have any climate stress or shock, they're so cash strapped because they get the payment terms of what they get paid by these exporters is so long. And so, of course, factoring, again, boring financial product, but actually its linkage to a farmer's cash flow resilience is massive in these markets where there's just more drought and more issues in the interim. And so I think we're willing to take that risk. We want to, defend it. We want to be as thoughtful about it and not greenwash, but we see that as kind of our job as pre-seed investors. And if we're successful, hopefully later stage investors then kind of, follow suit, or other capital providers. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I haven't gotten into, but from the earliest days of Mercy Corps Ventures, again, we wanted to build the fund that we wished existed when we were founders and operators. And part of that was we're in such a privileged position to have this large multinational nonprofit, Mercy Corps. So what can we take from Mercy Corps? And I say this in the nicest way possible, to support these small startups. Like, they, again, have every hurdle in the world. And yeah, what a privilege to be in the middle of that. Like, I can, work with our team and get Starbucks on the phone, executive level, to pay attention to one of our startups. Like, we just have this great platform to work with. And so, Hedel Patel, who was originally leading our platform team, and then Natalie Vergara, now who leads it, really designed a post-investment platform in that spirit. And over the years, and this was listed in our most recent impact report, I think we've really honed in on, now that we have north of 60 companies in our Fund 1 portfolio and another 20, 30 in the other funds, how can we design a platform that can really authentically work with the variety of needs in that global portfolio and effectively provide services to those companies and their kind of differing needs over time. And so I think the thing we've kind of recognized, and the big lesson we had last time, was like really focusing on what is it going to take for a company at pre-seed to get to seed stage? Where can we uniquely position? And I think usually, one, it's like governance, like how do we help companies own their governance and like interact and communicate more effectively with investors and other stakeholders. So we have a whole kind of like support service focused on that. How do we help companies just have an operating system financially, whether it's a fractional CFO that we have negotiated rates with, or other types of interventions to support companies? Again, just give them an operating system, take things off your plate, focus on product building, go to market. Like, let's take everything off your plate, including finance. And then third, how do we help you get as close as humanly possible to your customers? And that's a proxy for impact data. And again, how we kind of allow ourselves to get insights into that data and whether something's impactful or not is, through Lillian and Natalie and our team working with these companies. And, it's effectively impact management work. But what we're trying to do is to get really close to the founders and say, okay, what data flows do you create from your customers to understand if you deliver value proposition or not, if you deliver any value, which, effectively is impact. How do you think through that, optimize it? Think through the ways you collect data, different ways you collect it. Could we bring in, third parties or other sources of data? I mean, effectively what we're doing is trying to help them with product development. Like, how do you just stay as close as you humanly can to your customers at that earliest stage, figure out if what you're doing is on the right track or wrong track based on what you want to do, and then pivot when you need to. I mean, that's really the basis of our IMM work, very much in the spirit of 60 Devils and others. It's just gathering customer insights and responding to those and making sure you build that into your culture and DNA of the company and your systems. And if you have that at the earliest stage, it's not going to help you just make you commercially successful, but you're also going to give us great impact insights to develop the body of evidence. And, you're also going to be able to see whether or not this is creating the ripples of impact you thought you would when you founded this business.
Yeah, this whole process is what you refer to as the more than capital approach.
Yeah, exactly. I will never claim, we have an outsized effect on these founders. I mean, they're doing the hard work. If we're lucky, something we do contributes to their success, right? But these are the areas that we think, with what we have, the best we can do at the earliest stages in a scalable way with limited resources. And then beyond that, certainly, we're sitting on boards. Often, like I'm on the board of a Series B company. We have no right being there. We're the smallest shareholder, but we're invited to stay on because they value our perspective. They value who we are. We continue to add value. As we go later in stage, we're doing more B2B connections. I wish we did that better, frankly. I mean, we do, because of Mercy Corps, we are able to work with a lot of huge financial institutions, PayPal, a lot of the crypto folks, Starbucks, Mars. Like, we have great commercials, not right, but we have great, corporate relationships. And so we have been able to leverage those. I think, like a lot of other funds, if we were able to do that more effectively, that would be my dream for us, right? I mean, I think that's where we could really level up, is to help our companies better figure out how to navigate who are going to be most of their customers or acquirers one day, which is these large corporates in these food systems or other places that are going to see the long term of what they're doing. And we have some success, but that's where, I think I'm cautiously optimistic we will become that powerhouse one day, hopefully.
You have something called the Venture Lab Initiative, which is your grant making vehicle. What's the purpose of that vehicle? How does it connect to your broader investment thesis?
Our venture lab, we formed in, forgive me with COVID, time is a bit flat, so I'm forgetting, probably about 2019. We're seeing a lot of really interesting innovation at the fringe of our thesis. We just formed a resilient future thesis. At that point, we're excited about different technologies. It's like Web3 and crypto is the easiest one. It's a hard investment thesis from our fund one, but we're excited about it. We think it has real impact or utility, but it's really hard. Even today, there's not too much evidence base beyond some case studies around, does crypto work? Does it really reduce, transaction fees for some micro worker in Kenya or something? Like, there just wasn't much of an evidence base, certainly for an impact investor to invest in, but, from any donor trying to make an informed decision. So we formed a venture lab really centered around kind of the Web3 space originally, because it was an area we're interested in, and we wanted to help build the impact investment kind of evidence base around. And for ourselves, we wanted to test the market around whether or not this was an investable strategy as we started to do some experiments in it. And so our venture lab provides grants now across three different areas. One is Web3. The second is just the climate tech space broadly. And the third is humanitarian space. And we provide grants usually of $50,000 to $100,000, sometimes larger, to different technology entrepreneurs and larger corporates, if they're their partners, to test out the commercial viability and impact of these emerging technologies. And so we've done, I want to say, north of 30 pilots to date across those areas. We usually run calls for proposals in specific areas of our thesis we're excited about. We just did one in water management and water conservation in a climate venture lab. And so we kind of want to go to the entire world and say, what's the next wave of kind of water solutions that we're seeing that are technology driven? And how might it, again, admittedly small grant, help us to generate some sort of data around the efficacy of that solution and, again, the commercial potential of it. So we kind of look through those, and our investment team plus our venture lab team kind of get together and assess those. And it's a kind of fun, uncomfortable tension, because I think the venture lab team always has, for instance, we had one we funded, which was in glacier restoration, which to me seems crazy. What's the commercial model around glacier restoration? It is a very important thing to do. But, it's a good tension between the different members of the team around this is beyond my comfort zone, in the investment side. But for our venture lab team, they kind of see a different horizon. And can there be a market for how we reward kind of upstream water conservation through glacier restoration or other things, or Paramo restoration or things like that? It's a fun internal debate and mechanism to have to force our investment team not to get too conservative or too in our mode of operating. At the same time, allow a bit of space for a bit of R&D.
But that's pure grant making. There's no return.
We don't ask for any percentage of the company or anything. It's purely grant making. We do have a number of portfolio companies who have applied to the venture lab and gotten grants. We don't guarantee that either. Certainly, it's kind of a firewall process, but and then vice versa, we've had companies who've gotten pilot grants who then, we kind of see as an investment opportunity later. So for us, we see it as another way to kind of engage with the ecosystem. And, functionally, its basis, it makes us smarter investors, more impactful investors.
Going beyond Mercy Corps Ventures, you personally are an active angel investor, focusing on some startups that in the intersection of climate, regenerative land use, and technology. How does this personal investing complement your work at MCV?
I'm a white middle-class kid growing up in Chicago, so I have a lot of privilege compared to a lot of the folks I work with and have the opportunity to support. And again, harking back to my upbringing, my dad and mom always kind of instilled me with, if I ever have the means, I need to lift up and support others. And so the way I've always kind of looked at anything I do in the investment space is that, we see 3,000 deals a year in Mercy Corps Ventures, we try to help as many of those out as possible. We don't always live up to that. We try our best. Like, here's another person, here's some advice, whatever it is, right? But there's some subset that just for whatever reason aren't a fit for the fund. And, for me, I'm lucky enough to have a little bit of wealth, from the last 10, 15 years to kind of spread around. And more importantly, a bit of hard won, education, experiential education, networks and other things. And so I'm really keen to kind of back founders, building in areas that are going to make the world a better place for my kids, which is really my guiding principle. Some of it's just for fun, like some of it's just making a small investment in the World Climbing League because I love to climb. And I think a world where more people are climbing, including my kiddos, is a good world to be in. So some of it's not, purely in the space of conservation and nature and kind of sustainable agriculture, but really just backing, people I think doing great work and helping them realize their dreams, which I think will have a positive ripple impact on the world too.
You've set yourself a personal challenge to summit 52 peaks in 52 weeks. And that's for the Range of Motion project. This seems like an enormous commitment on top of running a venture fund. Tell me about this and what's motivated you to take that on.
I first met the team at Range of Motion Project some years ago. It was one of the main motivating factors for, why me and my family wanted to move to Quito. Just incredible humans doing really necessary work. Range of Motion Project's goal is effectively just to get as many prosthetics to people and care and therapy to underprivileged people as possible. The lack of, a limb can really make one's childhood, make one's adulthood and ability to work just dramatically different. It's a simple proposition. I feel like a lot of my time in my normal day job is spent on how do we help our food system shift and all these kind of esoteric things, which will take, decades to play out. And I think Range of Motion Project, it's really simple. I remember meeting a little kid, when I first decided to start this challenge in December, William, who born without a limb, had a little leg, 3 years old, and just running around like the little center I was at in Quito, and just like one of my little kids. And for me, it was just kind of, he now has the opportunity to kind of live a normal life as any other. It's a very simple thing. The care and the impact is well understood. It's just a question of raising the money for it. As we can try to sort out the kind of systematic healthcare layer that a lot of these countries just don't have to do it in a long-term way. And so for me, I'm really proud to join ROMP. They do this annual climb up Cotopaxi. There'll be 20 of us, adaptive athletes, supporters like myself, and former ROMP patients, which is the greatest thing. These patients who've gone through their care program and gotten prosthetics in Guatemala and Ecuador who are going to join us to try to summit Cotopaxi, which is about 20,000 feet, pretty nice glacier on top. And so we're going to all come together this October. And, for me, I love spending time in the mountains. It's, one of my favorite things. If I'm not doing my day job, I'm out with the kids camping or, trying to get other people out there. And so for me, setting this 52 peaks in 52 weeks was a bit of just saying, I want to try to raise as much money as possible for the great work ROMP is doing. And I want to set an excuse to, get out there with fellow ROMP climbers, fellow friends. So far, I'm at 25 out of 52. Have some work to do, but I try to cram it in, wake up at like 3 a.m. and run up the volcano in Quito and get back before my Zoom call or something like that. Do my best. As long as I don't get injured or struck by lightning, I think I should get there, hopefully.
Well, I feel fortunate we're able to even do the podcast here today. Together.
Chicago, there's not much to climb this week, so that's all right.
What's the closest you've come to not making it down a mountain safely?
Mountaineering is new to me overall. Like, I've been rock climbing 15 years. I used to do crazy bike trips across Asia and all these things. And so I feel like a lot of things in life led me to feel comfortable up in the mountains. But my hardest experience out of these 25 so far was probably Cotopaxi. I summited Cotopaxi about 6 weeks ago. I followed an alpinism training plan, felt really fit. I'd done a bunch of peaks at like 16, 17,000 feet. So I felt like I'd done everything impossible, kind of refreshed all my like glacier skills and all that sort of stuff. But, you can't control every variable. And so didn't really sleep too well. We're sleeping at like 16,000 feet, didn't sleep well. There was a snowstorm that night. So it was just kind of white out, just a slog, at that height, you just never know how altitude's going to affect you. And so we ended up having to kind of go up very fast. There was no view at the top, snapped a picture of nothing and, walked down carefully in like 2 feet of snow. It was a really hard experience. And, again, each one of these things will humble you. I've gone on Bahasa, which is supposed to be an easy hike. I think I spent more time on my butt and had more bruises and cuts from that hike because I kept slipping in the mud than Cotopaxi or something more intense. So you just never know what you're going to get up there. And to me, that's probably the most exciting part, is that kind of loss of control and awe, and you never know what you're going to get, and hopefully you're with your good people that can support you and you can enjoy it with.
You spent nearly a decade building businesses across Asia before returning to work in VC. If you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice before heading to Cambodia, what would it be?
That's a hard one because it was just so perfect. It was so nice to get knocked around, learn things. Any bad experience I had was just, I grew from it and it was lovely. So, no, I think the only thing I would say is like, I'm not an extroverted person, and it takes a lot of energy for me to be out there. I surprised myself thinking about it. I mean, like I was a kid freshman year in college who would kind of hide in my dorm room Friday and Saturday nights, to be honest. I was just terrified of social interaction, a lot of anxiety. And so I think that something flipped when I moved to Cambodia, and I think I got a bit over that for some reason. Maybe it's like living in another culture or place or whatever it is, you can create a new identity. But I do think like if I could have told myself, like getting on that plane to Cambodia, probably putting myself out there and just being like bringing more of my authentic human self to people, as opposed to probably a bit more of I was trying to build I don't want to say build a brand. I wasn't doing that, but I think there was a bit of a facade there with like a lot of like the humans I was interacting with, where authentically I just wanted to get to know them and the cool work they were doing and just like them as humans. And that ended up happening. But I think I could have been more intentional about it. I think I could have told my younger self that maintaining that facade is not necessary. Like, like everybody's there just to kind of get to know each other. Like a lot of people actually want to help you out if you kind of let that space open. I mean, vice versa. That'd be the secondary thing I'd say is like, I think there are a lot of relationships that, I wish I had prioritized or spent more time maintaining, right? Like there's just a lot of incredible humans that I lost touch with. And I think as I get older and I reflect on that, I'm like, I wish I had put the same amount of energy into that as other things, right? And just like really maintaining that, because that's ultimately, so I'm told, I'll be left with at the end of this journey is those humans I get to spend it with. And so I try to compensate for that now, hopefully.
I have had similar thoughts, and it's funny. Proximity is a funny thing because some of these relationships are really close and valuable when the proximity is there, and it's easy to maintain it, very hard at a distance, especially as you get busy with other things, they get busy with other things. Tim, I've got a few rapid fire questions
Sure.
for you before we wrap up. Don't overthink these.
Yeah.
And
no worries.
Just give me whatever comes to your mind, or if nothing does, feel free to take a pass. That's okay too. If you had to name the one most important challenge in the impact VC space at this point in time, what would that be?
We need to get more money into just nature and biodiversity, full stop. Every indicator we have right now is we're working in severe reverse EUDR regulation. Coming is kind of a good step, but we're way behind what we need to do to preserve the world we want. And that's my biggest fear right now. And I don't think impact VC is quite moving as rigorously as we need to make sure that we don't just maybe reduce our emissions, but actually have a world that we want to live on, we can live on.
What do you know now about impact VC investing that you wish you would have known when you co-founded Mercy Core Ventures?
I didn't come to this with like a strong fund management background, right? So I think knowing what I've learned over the last 5 or so years around like venture capital as a business, like what's the business model? What are the pressures you have from limited partners and all those things, right? That was a learning curve for me for the first few years, right? And so I think having the part of that might have been a good thing. So you can invent something when you don't know how it already works to some extent, right? But on the other hand, I think my learning curve and how long it took me to understand what are DFIs really looking for? What do different types of LPs want? One family office is different. Understanding that business model of what pain points am I solving for these constituents I work with. I wish I had a bit of that frame of reference in the early days, right? Like from the early stages, like thinking of VC like a business in that regard, and downloading a bit of, how you kind of present yourself to that side of the coin, not just, the founders you're working with, right?
You don't have to name names, but can you describe an investment you made that you were convinced of at the time that it ticked all your impact boxes, but in the end, it didn't turn out? And what was the lesson learned from that experience?
We invested in a company. This was an earlier vintage, so it wouldn't be something we would probably do these days. But, effectively what they're trying to do was move more value add processing to origin. So, how can we help farmers get the value add price versus exporting, their green beans to the US or whatever it is, right? And so logically made a ton of sense. I mean, like, of all the levers you can pull to change a farmer's life, getting them 5, 10x the price is the biggest. Anything else is really just work around the margins. And so took, depth, breadth of impact, reach was huge with that impact. Like IMM wise, just knocked out of the park. Commercially, it was our first consumer facing investment. And that was, kind of the downfall. It's like, how do you, like, they had early, success in selling into like Aramark and like the Google offices and like some of these big tech brands that wanted ethical supply chains. But, in retrospect, doing consumer facing VC is just funds build their entire careers over that. You just have to really know how to work in these competitive markets. And I think we knew the other side of it, like the supply side, but the demand side was just, none of the other investors, frankly speaking, I think really brought that paradigm into it. And so ended up kind of getting to this level and kind of trickling away, but never realizing, I think, the potential, whereas other companies, really overtook it. So it's somewhat of a disappointing one, I think. Yeah.
What was the lesson you learned from that as an investor?
I think that was when we were growing as a fund and thinking we could kind of do everything, right? Like, just because we're experts in supply side, we thought, don't worry, like, the demand is obvious, as opposed to, well, no, we need to do significantly more diligence or bring in the right co-investor who's going to help you penetrate, US, European market for coffee is just, it's like, it's crazy. There's every player in the world. It sounds great. It sounds easy to win 1% of this huge market, but winning that is a huge challenge, and understanding if you have the right team and the capital and all that sort of stuff. And so I think for us, we need to know where we're strong and be ready to say no to deals where we just can't analyze them or get confident that they can fulfill the commercial side that we may or may not actually be experts in, right?
Deciding what you're not going to do is just as important as deciding what you're going to do,
Yeah, no, 100%.
Now, the converse of that, can you describe an investment that you had some level of skepticism about the investment, either at the time you invested or maybe you passed on it, and in the end, if you did invest, it really was a runaway winner and way better than you thought? Or if you passed on it, you wish you hadn't, knowing now how it came out? And what was the lesson learned from that experience?
Yeah, I'll give one example. It's a company, I don't think they're yet a runaway success, but I think they're very much on that trajectory. It's a company called Meridia, based out of the Netherlands, but originally really founded in Ghana. And I first met Thomas, the founder, in probably 2015 in Jakarta when he pitched me on a completely different business idea in the same company, but just they pivoted. Said no, because, effectively what they were promoting was ahead of its time. It's like, how can we understand land tenure data and promote kind of land tenure? Land tenure is one of the biggest issues and inhibitors to economic development in emerging markets. Something like 70% of the world is operating on land that they don't own or have real rights to, which creates all sorts of problems, right, for taxation, for investment, all these things. We said no to it. I think he pitched us 2 other times in 2017 as they made other pivots, and we said no. And it wasn't until 2018, when they pitched us and they were really becoming this critical infrastructure layer for ag data, where we said, yeah, that's in our wheelhouse. We understand the ag space really well. We have connections to all these corporates. We understand kind of like building that first mile data layer for ag is crucially important. So we made the investment. Yeah, they fulfilled like every hypothesis we had, especially now as you have European deforestation regulation and that first mile data not just being useful for sustainability or commercial purposes, but if you want to have your commodity enter the EU, you need Meridia to verify it or to support it. And so they, signed a large Series A last year with International Commodity Exchange, ICE. They're integrated into that futures platform. So pretty much any financial transaction with an EUDR commodity is going to have Meridia, verifying it coming in later this year. And so it's just one of those where, again, from my first interaction with the founder in 2015, the right team, maybe not quite the right idea, but on the right trajectory. And for me, maintaining that relationship, kind of seeing something in him and the team, and that they're on to like the right area, but honing in the problem set and, making sure to, yeah, not lose sight of like how can we be supportive to these people who've really upped into their lives. They've given up comfortable things maybe they're doing, or they could do other things, but they're committed to these problems. And how can you be supportive? And that's the only reason we were in the deal is because and continue to be on the board. And other thing is because we kind of followed that, supported it, and did what we could to hustle to make it a success.
So what was your lesson learned?
Twofold. One, like you need that type of resilient founder. I mean, that company was founded in 2015. It's only hitting its inflection point right now. And it's there because the founding team, the tenacity, the resilience. I mean, I think crucially, their willingness to hit the gas and also decelerate. They survived COVID. They survived no revenue for periods of time because they made severe cuts and survived, whereas a bunch of others didn't. And then with the regulation taking form the last 2 years, they've hit the gas, raised another round, found the right commercial partnerships. Timing is everything in this business. And that team has had the resiliency to latch on to kind of a problem set and core value proposition, but then kind of wait for the market to value it or hit the gas when they see a way to create that new market around regulation. And so to me, that was kind of like, how can you better see that in a team or a company? And then you can never get the timing right, but figure out that wisdom in the founding team you're investing in so that you can see that they're going to steward that capital and their growth effectively. And, again, hit the gas when they see that opening and kind of trust them to do it.
But at the outset, were you skeptical because you didn't feel they could go the distance?
I was skeptical because they had pitched, like they're onto the right problem set, like land, tenure, boundary mapping, all that was a huge issue in 2015. But the way they were approaching it was, how can we gamify it, right? Like have a farmer map their land and then, create some sort of, it would be almost a very Web3 thing. Create some sort of incentive for that farmer then to get their neighbor to do the same thing. And you create this like quadrant of all the polygons in a low cost way. When I was talking to our team, and this gets into the Mercy Corps, I think advantage is when I was talking to our Indonesia team, they were like, that's way too simplistic. I mean, you have Butatis, you got like 3 different registration bodies. They're like, that's never going to work because the farmer wants that piece of paper from 3 different layers. And if that system doesn't deliver that, it doesn't give them any value. And so for me, that was a skepticism. Is like, it sounded cool from a pitch deck and it sounded cool from like a tech bro angle, but it needed to be a lot more baked. If I wanted my Indonesia team at Mercy Corps, who knows ag, they're farmers themselves, to themselves use this product, this is what they needed to see. And so I said, no, well, come back, let's stay in touch. I mean, it's a cool problem they're working around. And I think, you guys will get it, but right now, it's just not the go-to-market we think is going to work. So we'll wait to see how it goes.
If someone wants to get into the impact VC investing space, where would you advise them to start?
I have a bias. I never did a master's or MBA, and I don't have any real credentials, to be honest. I didn't work at Goldman Sachs or anything. I have the pleasure to employ many of those folks who really augments my shortcomings. I think there's 2 paths. You can go learn the technical skills kind of in the corporate environment, which is fantastic. Like, firm fundamentals are really crucial. It kind of depends on, your own individual debt situation, all those types of things. But I would never discount the actual experience of working in a startup, working with, these founders on the ground. And so I think whatever path you choose, I think some portion of it should include the experience of founding or operating, probably operating realistically if you don't have a burning passion inside you. Just being an advocate, being a supporter, getting your hands dirty, seeing what it is like to be in one of these startups, experiencing the ups and downs, doing what you can to whatever privilege you have to support, these guys and transforming what they're doing. I think that makes you a smarter investor. And, personally speaking, I think jumping between those worlds is really healthy and important. Keep you honest on both sides.
I'm sure you, like me, can think of examples of people who had too much of one or the other. You need to have a mix. If you don't have good, strong financial skills, well, that's just not sustainable, really. A company that doesn't make money is not a sustainable company. On the other hand, if you don't have operating experience, boy, you can see that right away too, huh?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like as we've grown as a team, really it was just me and Scott for a while. We've just had the pleasure to put on that hat and how do we create a diversification across our team with that right mix so we don't end up, too risk adverse with a bunch of accountants like myself and others who are just super excited by every shiny object. So we try to create that balance because, ultimately, that's what hopefully creates better outcomes for our partners and LPs and the whole ecosystem.
Tim, this has been super fascinating for me. Your journey from those early garage sale days in Chicago to co-founding an impact investing platform that's really innovative is a very compelling story. And the way you're using everything, including blockchain, to tackle climate adaptation in emerging markets is impressive. You've got a lot of stories to tell. So really, thanks for taking time to do a deep dive with us today. I really learned a lot from it all.
No, thanks, Scott. I really appreciate the opportunity. And if I can be helpful to anybody who's listening to this or in your networks, always really happy to have a virtual coffee.
So before we wrap up here, tell everyone where they can find out about all the great things you guys are doing at Mercy Corps Ventures, and so they can connect with the work you're doing.
We're changing the website right now, but it's mercycorpsventures.com, if I'm not mistaken, or mercycorpsventures.vc. We'll be switching that over in the next week. And then, for everything on my range of motion projects and the 52 Bigs in 52 Weeks, as well as my angel investing, you can find that at timothyrann.com.
And Rann is RANN.
Yep, that's right. 2 N's.
And what's the best way for people to reach out to you directly if someone wants to get in touch with you?
You can go to my website and there's a contact me, which goes straight to me. So I'm always happy to hear pitches, always happy to help out however I possibly can.
Everyone should definitely check out Mercy Corps Ventures. Is it .vc or .com or which one?
We're switching it over next week. So I think .com is the safer bet, mercycorpsventures.com.
All right. And of course, for people are listening to this, Corps is CORPS. So it's mercycorpsventures.com or eventually VC, for the investment work. And for your personal website,
Timothy, RANN.com.
Timothy, it's very formal.
I used to be Tim, and I morphed to Timothy at some point in Asia. I don't know why.
Right. And then I think you're on Twitter as well, at Tim Rann on Twitter, right?
Not as much Twitter these days, but I'm on there.
All right, Tim, thanks so much for this.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
All right, Tim. Thanks again. Goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.